As the gentle hush of the evening settles and the world outside begins its slow retreat into slumber, we invite you to embark upon a quiet journey. A journey not of immediate destination, but of observation and gentle contemplation. Allow the subtle sounds around you to fade and permit your thoughts to drift, unburdened, toward a different time, a different landscape. Tonight, we shall softly explore the contours of a life deeply etched into the fabric of American history. We will speak of Robert E. Lee not in the clamour of debate, nor through the lens of present-day judgment, but as a figure whose existence unfolded across decades of profound change. Our aim is simply to observe, to trace the path of a man born into a world vastly different from our own, and to follow his journey through its various seasons. This is an invitation to stillness, to a shared moment of historical reflection, where the complexities of the past are approached with a calm and steady gaze. There will be no urgency in our pace, no sharp pronouncements, only the steady rhythm of a story unfolding. We will move through his formative years, his education, his early career, and the pivotal moments that shaped his destiny, all with an unwavering commitment to a tranquil, factual recounting. Imagine a quiet library late at night, the only sound the turning of pages, the soft glow of a reading lamp illuminating ancient texts. It is in this spirit that we begin. Let us together drift back to the closing years of the 18th century, to the very beginning of a life that would, in time, become the subject of immense scrutiny. Allow your mind to gently absorb the details, to connect with the past in a way that is both informative and deeply restful. We are simply observers, tracing the gentle arc of a human life through the passage of time. To truly understand any individual, it is often necessary to gently unfurl the larger tapestry of their era. Robert E. Lee's life unfolded across the vast expanse of the 19th century, a period of profound transformation for the young American nation. This was a time when the rhythm of daily existence moved at a pace far different from our own. News travelled slowly, often by horseback or sailing ship, and the sprawling territories of the United States were connected by nascent roads and waterways, rather than by rapid communication networks. The nation itself was still finding its footing, navigating the complex aftermath of its founding, and grappling with questions of identity, expansion, and the ever-present tension surrounding the institution of slavery. It was an era marked by a deep reverence for classical ideals, a burgeoning sense of national purpose, and a society largely agrarian in its character. Family ties were often paramount, and honour, duty, and reputation held significant weight in social interactions. Imagine a world without the constant hum of electricity, where light was provided by candle or oil lamp, and the quiet sounds of nature often dominated the soundscape. This was the backdrop against which Lee's early life would gradually unfold. The cultural landscape was shaped by widespread religious belief, a strong emphasis on education for the privileged, and a stratified social order. These were the subtle, yet powerful, like currents that influenced the perspectives and aspirations of those who lived within them. By observing this broader context, we gain a quieter appreciation for the forces that moulded the individuals of that time. It allows us to place Lee within his natural historical environment, understanding the world he inherited and the expectations it placed upon him, before we delve into the specific details of his personal narrative. This quiet immersion into the 19th century prepares us for a deeper, more reflective understanding of his journey. Within the quiet annals of Virginia's history, the name Lee resonated with a particular gravity. It was a lineage deeply entwined with the very fabric of the Old Dominion, stretching back through generations of prominent figures who had contributed to the colony and later the nascent republic. This was not merely a family name, it was a a whisper of past accomplishments that preceded young Robert. His father, Henry Lee III, was perhaps the most celebrated of these ancestors, known to history as Light Horse Harry. A distinguished cavalry officer during the American Revolutionary War, he earned the admiration of George Washington and was lauded for his bravery and tactical prowess. Beyond his military service, he also served as governor of Virginia and a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Such a father cast a long shadow, a silhouette of expectation that would naturally fall upon his descendants. Yet, alongside this distinguished public service, the Lee family's history also carried the burden of financial instability. Despite their aristocratic connections and prominent social standing, maintaining the grand estates and lifestyles often associated with their class proved a persistent challenge. Fortunes could ebb and flow, and even a celebrated name did not always guarantee enduring prosperity. This dichotomy, a legacy of honour intertwined with a reality of economic struggle, was a subtle but significant aspect of the environment into which Robert E. Lee was born. He arrived into a world where the achievements of his forebears were recounted with pride, where the weight of a renowned surname was palpable. This was a heritage that brought with it both prestige and a quiet pressure to uphold a certain standard, to live up to the echoes of greatness that permeated his family's story. The expectations, unspoken yet ever present, would undoubtedly shape his early understanding of duty and his place within the world. It was within the venerable walls of Stratford Hall, a grand yet subdued Georgian mansion nestled along the banks of the Potomac River, that Robert Edward Lee first entered the world on January 19, 1807. The estate itself was a testament to a bygone era of Virginian aristocracy, its imposing brick structure with 4 towering chimneys speaking of a lineage that had long since established its roots in the American landscape. Stratford Hall, even in its quiet grandeur, conveyed a sense of enduring history rather than overt opulence. The architecture, sturdy and symmetrical, reflected a practical elegance, designed for comfort and function as much as for aesthetic appeal. It was a place of broad, sun-drenched rooms, high ceilings, and the gentle creak of old floorboards, here where the Potomac winds often carried the scent of distant forests and the distant calls of river birds. In these early years, the surroundings of Stratford Hall would have formed the quiet backdrop to young Robert's nascent consciousness. While the family name, Lee, carried immense weight, his immediate environment, though historically significant, was not one of excessive display. The plantation operated with the rhythms of rural life, dependent on the land and its labour, a common reality for many prominent families of the era. The days of childhood at Stratford would have been marked by the routines of a large household, the presence of siblings, and the steady hum of plantation activities. There would have been the expansive fields, the nearby river offering both a pathway and a boundary, and the quiet dignity of the ancestral home itself. It was a setting that, despite its historical resonance, presented a childhood devoid of ostentation. The grandeur was inherent in the heritage, not necessarily in the daily experience of extravagant living. This early foundation, laid in the quietude of Stratford Hall, suggested a life that, from its very inception, was rooted in a sense of place and a profound connection to the historical currents of Virginia. It was a beginning that, though outwardly calm, held the seeds of a destiny yet unknown, shaped by the legacy of his name and the tranquil yet demanding environment of his birth. The early years of Robert E. Lee's life were profoundly shaped by the steadfast influence of his mother, Anne Hill Carter Lee. Following his father, Henry Light Horse Harry Lee's departure for the West Indies in 1813, driven by mounting debts and a search for relief from his financial burdens, Anne became the singular anchor for her children. Her quiet strength and unwavering resolve became the central force in young Robert's formative experiences. Anne Hill Carter Lee was a woman of refined character, possessing a deep sense of piety and an unshakable commitment to the upbringing of her children. In the absence of their father, she diligently undertook the monumental task of instilling in them the values she held most dear. Her guidance was gentle yet firm, emphasizing principles that would resonate throughout Robert's life. She taught her son the profound importance of duty, not merely as an obligation, but as a moral imperative towards family, community, and God. Self-control was another virtue she meticulously nurtured, understanding that the mastery of one's impulses was essential for honourable conduct and effective leadership. Piety, a deep and abiding faith, was woven into the fabric of their daily lives, providing a moral compass in an era of significant social change and personal challenge. Anne's influence extended beyond mere instruction. It was a living example. Faced with considerable financial difficulties and the social complexities of her husband's absence, she maintained a household with dignity and grace. Her resilience in adversity, her quiet fortitude, and her unwavering devotion to her children left an indelible mark on Robert. He observed her capacity to manage the household with limited resources, to prioritize the needs of her family, and to navigate personal hardship with an inner serenity. These lessons, absorbed not only through her words but through her very being, laid the groundwork for the disciplined character that would later define Robert E. Lee. His mother's guidance provided a moral framework, a practical understanding of responsibility, and a profound appreciation for the virtues of self-restraint and faith, shaping the trajectory of his early development in ways that would prove enduring. With the strong foundational values instilled by his mother, Robert E. Lee began to consider his future path. His early education, though somewhat informal, was rigorous, conducted primarily in private schools near his family's successive homes in Alexandria, Virginia. These institutions provided him with a solid grounding in classical subjects, mathematics, and the gentlemanly pursuits expected of a young man of his social standing. However, the shadow of his family's ongoing financial instability loomed large, influencing the practical considerations of his future. For a young man of distinguished lineage, yet without the immediate prospect of inherited wealth or a preordained comfortable career, the choice of a profession was a matter of significant deliberation. The traditional paths for gentlemen included law, medicine, or managing a plantation. Yet each of these options presented its own set of challenges, particularly the substantial capital often required to establish oneself successfully. It was against this backdrop that Robert E. Lee made the consequential decision to pursue a military career. This was not merely an impulsive choice, but a pragmatic calculation. The United States Military Academy at West Point offered a rigorous education, tuition-free, which was a considerable advantage for a family of limited means. Furthermore, a commission in the Army provided a stable profession, a guaranteed income, and a clear path for advancement based on merit and performance. Beyond the practicalities, a military career also resonated deeply with the values of honour and duty that had been so carefully cultivated within him. The Army represented a continuation of his family's legacy of public service. His father, Light Horse Harry Lee, had been a celebrated Revolutionary War hero. To serve one's country in uniform was considered a noble pursuit, a way to uphold the family name and contribute to the young nation. Thus, Lee's decision to seek admission to West Point was a confluence of factors: the desire for a stable and honourable profession, the financial realities of his family, and a personal inclination towards a life of discipline and service. It was a path that offered both material security and a profound sense of purpose, a way for a young man from a proud but struggling family to forge his own distinguished future. This choice marked a pivotal moment, setting him on a course that would profoundly shape not only his own destiny, but also the destiny of the nation. In the summer of 1825, Robert E. Lee entered the United States Military Academy at West Point, embarking on a path that would profoundly shape his character and professional life. The Academy at that time was a demanding institution, known for its rigorous curriculum and strict disciplinary code. Cadets were subjected to intense academic pressure and an unforgiving regimen of military drills and inspections, all designed to forge officers of competence and unwavering discipline. From the outset, Lee distinguished himself. He applied himself to his studies with an earnestness that quickly became apparent to his instructors and peers. His academic performance was consistently exceptional, particularly in the demanding subjects of engineering, mathematics, and military tactics. These were the core disciplines essential for a successful career in the Corps of Engineers, a branch he would later join, renowned for attracting the most brilliant graduates. Beyond his scholarly achievements, Lee quickly earned a reputation for impeccable conduct. West Point maintained a demerit system, meticulously recording every infraction, no matter how minor. Cadets accumulated demerits for everything from tardiness to untidy uniforms. Yet, throughout his entire 4 years at the Academy, Robert E. Lee never received a single demerit. This remarkable feat was a testament to his innate self-control, his meticulous attention to detail, and his unwavering commitment to the rules and expectations of the institution. This unblemished record was not merely an absence of mistakes. It reflected a deeply ingrained sense of duty, order, and personal responsibility. His peers observed his quiet diligence and his adherence to principle, qualities that set him apart even among a cohort of highly motivated young men. The discipline he had learned from his mother's careful guidance in his youth found its full expression within the structured environment of West Point. His time at West Point was more than just an education in military science. It was a crucible that refined his character. The demanding schedule, the intellectual challenges, and the strict code of conduct instilled in him a profound sense of honor, integrity, and perseverance. These formative years solidified the internal compass that would guide him through the intricate complexities of his later life. In 1829, Robert E. Lee graduated second in his class of 46 cadets, earning a coveted commission as a brevet second lieutenant in the Corps of Engineers, a prestigious assignment reflecting his outstanding abilities and exemplary conduct. Following his distinguished graduation from West Point, Robert E. Lee received his commission in the Corps of Engineers, a highly respected branch of the United States Army. His initial assignments were not on battlefields, but rather at sites of civil infrastructure, where the nation was actively developing its defences and improving its vital waterways. These early years were characterized by practical, hands-on work, translating theoretical knowledge into tangible structures. One of his first significant postings was to Fort Pulaski on Cockspur Island, Georgia, where he contributed to the construction of coastal defences. This was a substantial undertaking, involving the precise placement of thousands of tons of masonry to create a formidable fortress designed to protect the Savannah River. Lee, still a young officer, was tasked with various responsibilities, from surveying and supervising labour to ensuring the accurate execution of complex engineering plans. This work demanded not only technical proficiency, but also an ability to manage resources and coordinate diverse teams of workers under challenging conditions. Subsequently, Lee was assigned to similar projects along the Atlantic coast, including improvements to the harbour of St. Louis, Missouri, and adjustments to navigation on the Mississippi River. The Mississippi, a vast and powerful waterway, presented unique engineering challenges. Its shifting currents and seasonal floods required innovative solutions to maintain clear navigation channels and prevent erosion. Lee's work involved studying the river's dynamics, designing structures to guide its flow, and overseeing their construction. And these tasks were often arduous, requiring long hours in various weather conditions and far removed from the comforts of settled life. These early engineering assignments were foundational experiences. They provided Lee with invaluable practical training in leadership and problem solving. He learned to assess complex situations, to devise effective plans, and to implement them with precision and perseverance. He gained a deep understanding of logistical challenges, the management of personnel, and the practical application of scientific principles to real-world problems. The nature of his work fostered a meticulous approach to tasks and an appreciation for thorough preparation. Through these years, Lee developed a reputation as a diligent, capable, and reliable officer. His superiors recognized his quiet competence and his steady hand in executing the often demanding projects entrusted to him. These experiences, though seemingly far removed from the military campaigns of his later life, cultivated the organizational skills, the strategic thinking, and the calm decisiveness that would define his command. They were years of quiet construction, building not only forts and channels, but also the very foundations of his professional character. Amidst his diligent work as an engineer, a significant personal chapter unfolded in Robert E. Lee's life. In 1831, he married Mary Anna Randolph Custis, a union that brought him into one of Virginia's most distinguished families. Mary Custis was not only a woman of considerable intellect and artistic talent, but she also carried a unique historical lineage. She was the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, and her father, George Washington Parke Custis, was the adopted grandson of George Washington himself. This connection wove Lee into the very fabric of American founding history, a subtle yet profound thread in his life's tapestry. Their marriage took place at Arlington House, the Custis family estate, a grand Greek Revival mansion situated on a prominent hill overlooking the Potomac River and the nascent city of Washington. This estate, with its sweeping views and historical significance, became the family home, a place of respite and continuity amidst Lee's often itinerant military career. Arlington House was more than just a residence. It was a repository of Washington family artifacts and a symbol of a particular Southern aristocratic tradition. Over the years, Robert and Mary Lee's family grew. They would eventually have 7 children, 3 sons, George Washington Custis, William Henry Fitzhugh, and Robert Edward Jr., and 4 daughters, Mary Custis, Anne Carter, Eleanor Agnes, and Mildred Child. The rhythms of family life at Arlington House provided a domestic counterpoint to Lee's professional duties. While his engineering assignments often took him away for extended periods, his return to Arlington was a return to the warmth and activity of a bustling household. Mary Lee, despite her own declining health in later years, managed the large estate and oversaw the upbringing of their children. She fostered an environment rich in learning and cultural pursuits, encouraging her children's education and artistic inclinations. Lee, when present, was a devoted father, known for his gentle demeanour and his active participation in his children's lives. He instilled in them the same values of duty, honour and piety that had been so central to his own upbringing. He corresponded frequently with his wife and children when absent, his letters often filled with expressions of affection and concern for their well-being and progress. The domestic sphere at Arlington House, with its joys and challenges, offered Lee a grounding influence. It was a place where he could shed the responsibilities of his military uniform, if only temporarily, and embrace the roles of husband and father. This family life, steeped in Virginian tradition and Washingtonian legacy, provided a stable foundation for the man who would later face the immense burdens of national conflict. The quiet strength he drew from his home and his family was an essential, though often private, aspect of his complex character. The quiet rhythms of engineering work and family life were significantly interrupted by the outbreak of the Mexican-American War in 1846. This conflict provided a crucible for Robert E. Lee, transforming him from a capable engineer into a recognized military leader. He was assigned to the staff of General Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the American forces, a figure of considerable military experience and strategic acumen. Lee's role as a military engineer during the war was pivotal. His duties often involved reconnaissance, mapping terrain, and identifying optimal routes for troop movements and artillery placement. These were tasks that demanded not only a keen eye for topography, but also a cool head under fire. He distinguished himself repeatedly through acts of notable bravery, often venturing ahead of the main force to gather critical intelligence, sometimes under direct enemy observation or hostile fire. One of the most notable instances of his engineering skill and courage occurred during the advance on Mexico City. At the Battle of Cerro Gordo, Lee's reconnaissance efforts uncovered a hidden path around the Mexican flank, a route previously deemed impassable. This discovery allowed Scott's forces to outmaneuver the entrenched enemy, contributing significantly to a decisive American victory. His reports were precise, his judgment sound, and his ability to assess complex landscapes invaluable. General Scott, though a discerning observer of military talent, quickly recognized Lee's exceptional abilities. He referred to Lee as the very best soldier I ever saw in the field. This high praise was earned through consistent performance and an unwavering commitment to duty, even in the most perilous situations. Lee's actions throughout the campaign earned him a series of rapid brevet promotions for gallantry and meritorious conduct. He rose from captain to major, then to lieutenant colonel, and finally to colonel by the war's end. These were honorary ranks, but they reflected the profound impact of his contributions. The Mexican-American War was a crucial period of military maturation for Lee. It exposed him to the realities of large-scale combat, the complexities of logistics in hostile territory, and the pressures of command. He learned invaluable lessons in strategy, tactics, and leadership from General Scott and other officers, many of whom would later become prominent figures in the American Civil War, often on opposing sides. The experience refined his understanding of warfare, honing his natural talents and preparing him, though unknowingly, for the far greater challenges that lay ahead. He emerged from Mexico not just as a skilled engineer, but as a proven combat officer, his reputation for competence and courage firmly established within the United States Army. The campaigns in Mexico offered Robert E. Lee an immersive, practical education in the realities of warfare, a stark contrast to the theoretical lessons of West Point or the methodical work of engineering. He observed firsthand the intricacies of large-scale military operations, absorbing critical lessons that would subtly shape his future command decisions. One of the most profound lessons he gleaned concerned the effective deployment of artillery. He witnessed how well-placed batteries could soften enemy defences and create opportunities for infantry assaults. He learned the importance of coordinating different branches of service, understanding that cavalry, infantry, and artillery, when working in concert, presented a far more formidable force. The terrain itself often dictated tactical approaches, and Lee's engineering background provided him with unique advantage in interpreting and exploiting geographical features for strategic gain, whether for defence or offence. Logistics, too, became a central point of his education. Moving thousands of men, their supplies, and heavy equipment through difficult terrain, often far from established bases, presented enormous challenges. Lee observed the meticulous planning required to ensure that troops were fed, armed, and equipped, and that lines of communication remained open. He understood that a well-supplied army could sustain a campaign, while a poorly provisioned one was doomed to fail, regardless of its fighting spirit. These practical experiences instilled in him a deep appreciation for the vital, often unseen work of quartermasters and commissaries. Perhaps most significantly, Lee learned about leadership under fire. General Winfield Scott, his commander, was a master of grand strategy, but also a figure who inspired confidence and loyalty. Lee watched how Scott managed his diverse staff, delegated authority, assescium, and made critical decisions in the face of uncertainty and opposition. He witnessed the calming effect of a resolute commander on his troops during moments of intense combat. These observations undoubtedly influenced Lee's own measured and composed demeanour in battle, a trait that would become a hallmark of his command style. The Mexican War also served as a unique meeting ground for a generation of American officers. Lee interacted closely with many individuals who would later rise to prominence during the Civil War, some as his most trusted subordinates, others as formidable adversaries. Among them were Ulysses S. Grant, George B. McClellan, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, P.G.T. Beauregard, and George Pickett. They served together, shared hardships, and discussed military theory, thus forging bonds and rivalries that would later define a nation's conflict. These interactions provided Lee with invaluable insights into the capabilities and personalities of his fellow officers, knowledge that would prove profoundly significant in the years to come. The shared crucible of Mexico created a professional fraternity, even as it subtly laid the groundwork for future divisions. Following the cessation of hostilities in Mexico, Robert E. Lee returned to a military career that, for a time, moved away from the direct command of troops on the battlefield. His distinguished service, however, had positioned him for increasingly significant assignments within the United States Army. In 1852, he was appointed superintendent of the United States Military Academy at West Point, a role that brought him back to the institution where his own military journey had begun. This superintendency was a challenging yet ultimately rewarding period. Lee was tasked with maintaining the Academy's rigorous academic and disciplinary standards, while also adapting its curriculum to reflect the changing nature of warfare, particularly in light of the recent Mexican War. He focused on strengthening the engineering program, a field in which he possessed considerable expertise, and emphasized practical military instruction. He faced the perennial challenges of academic administration, managing faculty, disciplining cadets, and ensuring the Academy produced officers capable of leading the nation's army. His tenure was marked by a steady hand and a commitment to excellence, leaving an enduring impact on the education of future military leaders, many of whom would later serve under or against him. After his time at West Point, Lee sought a more active role, and in 1855 he was commissioned as a lieutenant colonel of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry. This assignment brought him to the frontier, specifically to Texas, where he served for several years. Life on the frontier presented a different set of challenges than those found in academic halls. His duties involved protecting settlers, mapping territories, and engaging in skirmishes with Native American tribes, primarily the Comanche. The vast, often unforgiving landscape of Texas demanded adaptability and resilience. He gained experience in cavalry tactics, scouting, and the logistical complexities of operating in remote areas with limited resources. These years in Texas were often lonely, marked by long separations from his family at Arlington. The frontier service was physically demanding and sometimes dangerous, but Lee approached it with his characteristic dedication. He continued to refine his leadership skills, learning to manage small units in unpredictable environments and to make swift decisions under pressure. Throughout these varied assignments, from the structured environment of West Point to the rugged expanses of the Texas frontier, Lee consistently demonstrated a steadfast commitment to his duty. Each role, regardless of its specific demands, further broadened his understanding of military operations and the complexities of command, quietly preparing him for the monumental challenges that lay ahead in the nation's unfolding narrative. The institution of slavery was deeply woven into the fabric of Southern society during Robert E. Lee's lifetime, and his personal relationship with it presents a complex aspect of his biography. Though he did not actively purchase or sell enslaved individuals himself, his life was inextricably linked to the system through his family, and most significantly through his wife's inheritance. Upon the death of his father-in-law, George Washington Parke Custis, in 1857, Lee became the executor of the Custis estate. This responsibility included the management of Arlington House and 2 other plantations, along with the approximately 189 enslaved people associated with these properties. Custis's will stipulated that these individuals were to be emancipated within 5 years of his death. Lee's role as executor placed him in direct administrative control over these enslaved men, women, and children. During the period between Custis's death and the mandated emancipation, Lee's management of the Custis estate, and by extension the enslaved population, has been a subject of historical scrutiny. Accounts from some of those enslaved individuals, later documented, describe a stricter regime than had been present under Custis, including instances of physical punishment for those who attempted to escape or resisted his authority. These actions stand in contrast to the more benevolent image often associated with Lee, and they highlight the inherent tensions and cruelties embedded within the system of slavery itself, even for those who might have expressed personal reservations about its morality. Lee's own views on slavery, as expressed in his private correspondence, were nuanced and at times contradictory. He referred to slavery as a moral and political evil, and expressed a belief that it would eventually disappear. However, he also believed that emancipation should occur gradually, through divine intervention, rather than through immediate abolitionist action, which he considered disruptive to the social order. He saw it as a burden on the white population, rather than primarily as an injustice to the enslaved. These perspectives reflected common sentiments among many Southern elites of his era, who acknowledged the institution's flaws but were deeply embedded in its economic and social structures. His actions as executor, particularly the delay in emancipation and the methods used to maintain control, illustrate the profound difficulties and moral compromises inherent in navigating a society built upon human bondage. The Custis slaves were eventually freed in December 1862, fulfilling the terms of the will, though this occurred amidst the tumultuous backdrop of the Civil War. Lee's personal involvement with slavery, therefore, remains a critical element in understanding the complexities of his character and the historical context in which he lived. As the 1850s progressed, the United States found itself increasingly fractured by profound political and social disagreements. A chasm widened between the northern and southern states, driven by fundamental differences in economic systems, interpretations of constitutional rights, and, most crucially, the institution of slavery. The North, with its burgeoning industrial economy, saw an expansion of free labour and a growing moral opposition to human bondage. Abolitionist sentiment, though not universally embraced, gained considerable ground, advocating for the immediate end of slavery and challenging its very legitimacy. This moral fervour often clashed with the South's agrarian economy, which was deeply reliant on enslaved labour for its prosperity, particularly in the cultivation of cotton. Southern states fiercely defended their right to maintain slavery, often framing it as a matter of states' rights and self-determination, free from federal interference. They argued that the Constitution protected their property rights, including the ownership of enslaved people, and viewed Northern attempts to restrict or abolish slavery as an assault on their way of life and sovereignty. Key legislative compromises, such as the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 attempted to quell the escalating tensions. However, these measures often backfired, further inflaming passions. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, for instance, introduced the concept of popular sovereignty, allowing residents of new territories to decide on the legality of slavery within their borders. This led to violent clashes in Kansas, earning it the grim moniker Bleeding Kansas, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions resorted to armed conflict. The Dred Scott Supreme Court decision in 1857 further exacerbated the divide, ruling that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, could not be American citizens and had no standing to sue in federal court. It also declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, asserting that Congress could not prohibit slavery in federal territories. This ruling was a significant victory for the South, but deeply angered the North, intensifying the sense that a peaceful resolution was becoming increasingly elusive. These mounting tensions, fueled by ideological clashes, economic disparities, and a fundamental disagreement over human liberty, pushed the nation ever closer to a precipice. The question of slavery, once a matter of political compromise, had transformed into an existential crisis, threatening the very unity of the United States. In October of 1859, a singular event unfolded that would dramatically underscore the nation's deepening divisions and serve as a chilling harbinger of the impending conflict. This was John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. John Brown, an ardent abolitionist who had previously engaged in violence during Bleeding Kansas, conceived a daring and desperate plan to seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, arm enslaved people, and ignite a widespread revolt across the South. On the night of October 16th, Brown and his small band of followers, numbering fewer than 24 men, launched their attack. They successfully captured the arsenal and several other key points in the town. However, their grand scheme quickly unravelled. The expected uprising of enslaved people did not materialize as Brown had hoped. Instead, local citizens and militia quickly responded, trapping Brown and his men within the engine house of the armory. News of the raid spread rapidly, causing alarm and outrage throughout the southern states. Hartwich saw it as an act of domestic terrorism and an endorsement of violent insurrection by Northern abolitionists. In Washington, D.C., authorities moved swiftly to suppress the rebellion. Colonel Robert E. Lee, then a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, was at his home in Arlington when he received orders to take command of a detachment of U.S. Marines and proceed to Harper's Ferry to restore order. Lee arrived on the morning of October 18th. After assessing the situation, he issued an ultimatum to Brown demanding a surrender. When Brown refused, Lee ordered the Marines to storm the engine house. The assault was swift and decisive. Under the direct command of Lieutenant J.E.B. Stewart, who was serving as Lee's aide, the Marines breached the doors and quickly overwhelmed Brown's remaining forces. John Brown himself was wounded and captured. The suppression of the raid was a military success for the federal government, executed with efficiency under Lee's command. However, the political and social repercussions were far more profound. In the North, while many condemned Brown's methods, some viewed him as a martyr for the cause of abolition, a man willing to sacrifice his life for a moral imperative. In the South, Brown's raid was widely interpreted as an act of war, a direct assault on their institutions and security, demonstrating the lengths to which abolitionists would go. This event solidified the belief in the South that their way of life, and indeed their very existence, was under imminent threat from the North. It hardened positions on both sides, making compromise seem all but impossible. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, though quickly suppressed, illuminated the deep, irreconcilable differences that gripped the nation, casting a long dark shadow forward, signalling that the era of political debate was rapidly giving way to the inevitability of armed conflict. The anxieties that simmered beneath the surface of American society, profoundly stirred by events like John Brown's raid, reached a critical boiling point with the presidential election of 1860. This election was unlike any before it, characterized by a fractured political landscape that mirrored the fractured nation itself. The Democratic Party, once a unifying national force, split into northern and southern factions, nominating two separate candidates. A third party, the Constitutional Union Party, also emerged, attempting to find a middle ground. However, it was the Republican Party, a relatively new political entity formed largely on an anti-slavery platform, that ultimately triumphed. Their candidate, Abraham Lincoln, a lawyer and former congressman from Illinois, was elected president. Lincoln's platform, though moderate in its stance against the spread of slavery, was unequivocally opposed to its expansion into new territories. For many Southerners, this position, combined with the Republican Party's general alignment with abolitionist sentiment, was perceived as an existential threat to their way of life, their economic system, and their constitutional rights. The election results were immediate and dramatic in the southern states. South Carolina, long a hotbed of secessionist sentiment and states' rights advocacy, acted swiftly. On December 20th, 1860, a little over a month after Lincoln's victory, South Carolina formally seceded from the Union. Its declaration cited the perceived hostility of the northern states toward the institution of slavery and the election of a president whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. This act by South Carolina ignited a chain reaction across the Deep South. Within the next 6 weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed suit. Each state issued its own declarations of secession, echoing similar grievances. The constitutional arguments for secession centered on the idea that the Union was a compact among sovereign states, and that states had the inherent right to withdraw from that compact if the federal government violated its terms or became destructive of the state's fundamental interests, and this was a direct challenge to the notion of a perpetual union. Beyond the legal arguments, a deep emotional fervour fueled these decisions. There was a pervasive fear among white Southerners of social upheaval, economic ruin, and a perceived loss of honour and autonomy. The election of Lincoln, who had not even appeared on the ballot in many Southern states, was seen as an act of Northern aggression, and a clear indication that their voices and interests would no longer be respected within the Union. The dream of a united America was dissolving, replaced by the stark reality of a nation divided, moving inexorably toward a confrontation that would redefine its very identity. As the Deep South states made their decisive moves towards secession, the focus of the nation, and particularly the attention of men like Robert E. Lee, turned to the Upper South. States like Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas initially hesitated, hoping for a peaceful resolution or a compromise that might avert the looming catastrophe. For Lee, a loyal officer in the United States Army, the unfolding crisis presented an agonizing personal dilemma, a profound struggle between deeply held principles and the powerful pull of his origins. Lee's loyalty to the Union was sincere and long-standing. He had dedicated his entire adult life to serving the United States, upholding its Constitution and defending its flag. He had taken an oath to that effect, an oath he held sacred. Throughout the escalating tensions of the 1850s, Lee consistently expressed his opposition to secession. He viewed it not only as unwise, but as a dangerous and ultimately futile act, and he believed that the Union, forged through the sacrifices of generations, was meant to be perpetual, and that dismembering it would lead only to strife and suffering. He had written privately of his belief that secession was a form of anarchy, a dangerous precedent that would undermine the very fabric of stable governance. Yet, alongside this profound commitment to the Union, there existed an equally powerful and perhaps even more primal bond: his loyalty to Virginia. Lee was, in every fibre of his being, a Virginian. His family lineage stretched back to the earliest days of the colony, deeply intertwined with its history, its soil, and its traditions. His home, Arlington, sat on a bluff overlooking the Potomac, a constant reminder of his roots. For Lee, Virginia was not merely a geographical location, it was an identity, a heritage, a sacred trust. He often spoke of his native state with a reverence that bordered on the spiritual. As the political debate raged within Virginia, with delegates meeting to consider secession, Lee watched and waited with a heavy heart. He was an observer, serving in Texas when the initial wave of secession occurred, and then returning to Washington, D.C. His professional duty as an army officer kept him engaged with the federal government, yet his thoughts were undoubtedly fixed on his home state. The prospect of taking up arms against his fellow Virginians, or conversely against the nation he had served, was an unimaginable burden. He found himself caught between two powerful, almost irresistible forces: the abstract ideal of the Union and the concrete visceral attachment to his native soil. This internal struggle was not unique to Lee, but for a man of his character, integrity, and deep sense of duty, it was particularly acute. He sought guidance in prayer, grappling with a decision that he knew would define the rest of his life and profoundly impact the course of the nation. The quiet authority he had always projected was now accompanied by an immense internal turmoil, hidden from public view, but deeply felt. The tension in Washington, D.C. was palpable in April of 1861. Fort Sumter had been fired upon, and President Lincoln had issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The United States was now undeniably on the precipice of civil war. Amidst this escalating crisis, an extraordinary offer was extended to Robert E. Lee, an offer that underscored his high standing within the military and the nation's desperate need for skilled leadership. On April 18, 1861, Francis P. Blair, a trusted advisor to President Lincoln, summoned Lee to his residence. Blair conveyed a direct message from the president himself. Lee was offered the command of the Union Army, the primary force being assembled to protect the capital and confront the seceded states. It was an unprecedented proposition, recognizing Lee's distinguished record, his engineering prowess, and his combat experience from the Mexican-American War. For a career officer, such an offer represented the pinnacle of professional achievement, a monumental opportunity to lead the nation's armed forces. Lee listened to Blair's offer with his characteristic composure, though the weight of the moment was undoubtedly immense. He was a man of deep reflection, and this decision, perhaps more than any other in his life, demanded careful, agonizing consideration. He expressed his grave concern for the future of the country, reiterating his opposition to secession and his hope that a peaceful resolution might still be found. He spoke of his deep attachment to the Union, the institution he had served faithfully for over 3 decades. However, the agonizing internal struggle he had been experiencing reached its crescendo. His profound loyalty to Virginia ultimately proved to be the decisive factor. Lee explained to Blair that while he could not raise his sword against his native state, neither could he participate in an invasion of the South. As he stated that he could not take part in an invasion of the southern states. He would not, he declared, accept a command that would require him to lead forces against his home and his people. The decision was made. Lee respectfully declined President Lincoln's offer. This moment marked a definitive turning point, not only in Lee's personal trajectory, but in the unfolding history of the Civil War. His refusal meant that the Union would lose one of its most capable officers, and the Confederacy would soon gain a commander whose strategic brilliance would define much of the conflict. The path he chose, while deeply personal, had far-reaching national consequences. Having respectfully declined the command of the Union Army, Robert E. Lee's path became clearer, though no less fraught with sorrow. 2 days after his meeting with Francis P. Blair, on April 20th, 1861, Lee formalized his painful decision. From his home in Arlington, he penned a letter of resignation from the United States Army, the institution he had served with unwavering dedication for over 3 decades. This was not an act of impulsive rebellion, but the culmination of a deeply personal and agonizing struggle. His letter to General Winfield Scott, his former mentor and commander, conveyed the profound weight of the moment. Lee expressed his regret at severing ties with an organization he held in such high esteem. He acknowledged the ties of duty and honor that bound him to the Union. Yet, he explained that he could not bring himself to participate in a war against his native state. His conscience, he wrote, would not permit him to draw his sword against Virginia. The resignation was a testament to the powerful hold of state loyalty for many Southerners of his era. For Lee, Virginia was more than just a place. It represented his heritage, his family's history, and a deeply ingrained sense of belonging. To fight against it would have been, in his view, a betrayal of his deepest allegiances, a violation of an intrinsic moral code. This was a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to the service of the United States, rising through its ranks with distinction, upholding its flag, and defending its interests. To walk away from that life, from that identity, was an act of immense personal sacrifice. The decision was made in the quiet solitude of his study, but its reverberations would shake the nation. His resignation was met with a mixture of dismay in the North and a sense of relief and hope in the South. For Lee himself it marked a profound rupture with his past, a definitive turning point that irrevocably altered the course of his life and placed him on a trajectory into the heart of the looming conflict. He was no longer a United States Army officer. He was now a Virginian, preparing to defend his home, wherever that path might lead him. The emotional toll of this choice was immense, a quiet sorrow carried within the stoic demeanour of a man committed to what he believed was his inescapable duty. With his resignation from the United States Army now a matter of record, Robert E. Lee's path immediately led him into the service of his home state. On April 23, 1861, just 3 days after his farewell to the Union, Lee travelled to Richmond, the capital of Virginia. There he met with the Virginia Convention, which had recently voted to secede from the Union. The delegates, keenly aware of Lee's reputation and military prowess, offered him the position of commander of Virginia's military forces. Lee accepted this commission with a quiet solemnity, reflecting the gravity of the moment rather than any overt enthusiasm. His acceptance speech was brief and underscored his sense of duty to his native state. He spoke of his deep gratitude for the trust placed in him and expressed his resolve to defend Virginia to the best of my ability. There was no rhetoric of Southern nationalism or fiery declarations against the Union. Instead, his words conveyed a profound sense of obligation, the commitment to protect his home and its people in a time of great peril. This initial appointment placed Lee at the head of Virginia's state troops, a provisional force that would soon be integrated into the larger Confederate Army. As other Southern states joined the Confederacy, and Virginia itself formally acceded to the Confederate States of America, the structure of military command evolved. Lee's role transitioned from leading Virginia's forces to serving within the broader Confederate military hierarchy. His initial duties involved organizing and preparing Virginia's defenses. He quickly set about inspecting fortifications, advising on strategic placements, and training the newly assembled volunteer regiments. This period was characterized by intense administrative and organizational work, that drawing upon his extensive experience in engineering and logistics from his long career in the U.S. Army. He approached these tasks with his characteristic thoroughness and methodical precision, laying the groundwork for the state's military readiness. For Lee, joining the Confederacy was not driven by an ideological embrace of the secessionist cause or a fervent belief in the institution of slavery, which he personally viewed as a moral and political evil, though he was himself a slaveholder through inheritance. Instead, his allegiance stemmed from a deeply ingrained sense of loyalty to Virginia, a principle that for many of his generation superseded even loyalty to the federal government. He saw himself as a citizen of Virginia first, and when his state chose its course, he felt bound to follow, believing it was his duty to stand with his people. This was a man answering a call he felt compelled to obey, rather than an eager participant in a revolutionary movement. Following his initial organizational work in Richmond, Robert E. Lee was dispatched to the mountainous region of Western Virginia in the summer of 1861. This assignment marked his first field command in the newly formed Confederate Army, a period that would prove to be challenging and, for many, less than auspicious. The task before him was formidable. To coordinate disparate Confederate forces and repel Union advances into an area where loyalty to the Confederacy was far from universal. The terrain itself presented significant obstacles. The rugged mountains, dense forests, and unpredictable weather made troop movements difficult and communications unreliable. The Confederate forces in the region were a mix of state militias and newly raised volunteers, often lacking in training, equipment, and cohesive command. Personal rivalries among various commanders further complicated Lee's efforts to establish a unified and effective strategy. Lee's campaign in Western Virginia included efforts to relieve Confederate forces besieged at Cheat Mountain and operations in the Kanawha Valley. These endeavors did not yield the decisive victories that might have been expected from an officer of Lee's caliber. At Cheat Mountain, a combination of misleading intelligence, difficult weather conditions, and a lack of coordination among his subordinates led to a failed offensive in September. The Union forces, well entrenched and alert, successfully repelled the Confederate attack, resulting in a tactical defeat for Lee. This early period of the war was a steep learning curve for all involved, including Lee himself. The nature of warfare had begun to shift, and the grand, set-piece battles of previous eras were often replaced by skirmishes in difficult terrain, demanding different tactical approaches. Lee, accustomed to the disciplined and well-supplied regular army of the United States, encountered the realities of a nascent military, struggling with logistics, inexperienced troops, and often fractious leadership. The lack of clear success in Western Virginia led to some criticism from the press and within Confederate circles. Some observers, unfamiliar with the immense difficulties Lee faced, questioned his effectiveness. Yet these early experiences, though not victorious, provided Lee with invaluable insights into the challenges of commanding volunteer armies, operating in unforgiving landscapes, and managing diverse personalities under the immense pressures of war. They were an initial, formative chapter in his Confederate service, preceding the more renowned campaigns that lay ahead. Following the complexities and limited successes of his Western Virginia campaign, General Lee was recalled to Richmond. In March of 1862, President Jefferson Davis appointed him as his military advisor, a role that positioned Lee at the strategic heart of the nascent Confederacy. This period, often overlooked in the dramatic narrative of Lee's field commands, was nonetheless crucial for the Confederacy and for Lee's own development as a strategic thinker in the broader context of the war. As military advisor, Lee did not hold direct command over troops in the field, but rather served as a vital sounding board and strategic planner for the president. Davis, himself a West Point graduate and former U.S. Secretary of War, possessed a keen understanding of military affairs. The relationship between the two men was one of mutual respect, allowing Lee to offer candid assessments and innovative proposals regarding the Confederacy's overall defense. In this capacity, Lee's influence began to extend across all theatres of the conflict. He reviewed intelligence, analysed Union movements, and provided recommendations on troop deployments, fortifications, and logistical challenges. His deep understanding of military engineering, honed during his decades of service, he proved particularly valuable in planning defensive works around vital cities and strategic points. He was instrumental in shaping the defensive posture of Richmond, anticipating Union General McClellan's movements during the Peninsula Campaign. Lee's strategic insights during this advisory period were characterized by a focus on interior lines of communication, allowing for the rapid transfer of troops between threatened sectors. He also emphasized the importance of aggressive defense, seeking opportunities to strike at isolated Union forces rather than merely reacting to their advances. Although his direct authority was limited, his counsel became increasingly influential in the Confederate High Command. This time spent advising President Davis allowed Lee to observe the broader strategic picture of the war, moving beyond the immediate tactical concerns of a single campaign. It provided him with an intimate knowledge of the Confederacy's strengths and weaknesses, its resources, and the challenges faced by its diverse armies. This period of quiet, behind-the-scenes influence proved to be an invaluable preparation for the greater responsibilities he would soon undertake, solidifying his reputation as a thoughtful and capable strategist within the Confederate government. The spring of 1862 brought the Union Army of the Potomac, under General George B. McClellan, dangerously close to the Confederate capital of Richmond. General Joseph E. Johnston, commanding the primary Confederate forces defending the city, found himself engaged in a series of engagements along the Warwick Line and then at the Battle of Seven Pines, also known as Fair Oaks, in late May and early June. During this intense fighting, a critical event transpired that would irrevocably alter the course of the war in the Eastern Theatre. On May 31st, 1862, General Johnston sustained a severe wound during the Battle of Seven Pines, struck by a shell fragment in the shoulder and then by a bullet to the chest. His injuries were such that he was immediately incapacitated and unable to continue commanding the army. This sudden vacancy at the head of the Confederate forces defending Richmond created an urgent and profound leadership crisis. President Jefferson Davis, who'd been working closely with General Lee as his military advisor, recognized the immediate need for a new commander. Without hesitation, Davis appointed Robert E. Lee to take charge of the army. This appointment, made on June 1st, 1862, he marked a profound turning point in Lee's military career and, indeed, in the history of the Confederacy. The army he now commanded was initially known as the Army of the Peninsula, but very soon thereafter it would become famously known as the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee's assumption of command was met with a degree of apprehension by some within the army and the public. His prior field command in Western Virginia had not been a resounding success, and his advisory role, while strategically important, had kept him out of the direct limelight of battlefield victories. Some soldiers, upon learning of his appointment, even referred to him by the somewhat disparaging nickname Granny Lee, reflecting a perception that he was perhaps too cautious or not aggressive enough for the desperate situation confronting Richmond. However, Lee approached his new command with characteristic composure and a clear strategic vision. He inherited an army that, while determined, was facing a numerically superior and well-equipped Union force at the very gates of the capital. The immediate task was to defend Richmond, but Lee's strategic mind was already contemplating how to transition from a purely defensive posture to one that could seize the initiative. His appointment to lead the Army of Northern Virginia ushered in an era of audacious generalship that would define the Confederacy's struggle for independence. This moment represented not merely a change of leadership, but the dawn of a new, formidable chapter in the Civil War. Upon assuming command of the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee immediately set about reorganizing and fortifying his positions around Richmond. However, his true intention was not merely to defend, but to launch a decisive offensive against General McClellan's Army of the Potomac, which lay encamped just a few miles from the Confederate capital. This bold plan, conceived almost immediately after his appointment, would manifest as the 7 Days' Battles. Lee's strategy was audacious, particularly for a commander whose reputation had, until that point, been one of caution. He intended to mass a significant portion of his army and, in conjunction with the returning forces of Major General Thomas Stonewall Jackson from the Shenandoah Valley, strike at McClellan's right flank, which was positioned north of the Chickahominy River. The aim was to sever McClellan's supply lines to the Pamunkey River and drive the Union Army away from Richmond. The 7 Days' Battles commenced on June 25, 1862, with a Union probing attack at Oak Grove. However, the true Confederate offensive began the following day with the Battle of Mechanicsville. Lee's plan relied heavily on coordinated movements and aggressive assaults, and while these initial engagements did not always unfold precisely as intended, they nonetheless exerted immense pressure on the Union forces. Over the next week, a series of intense and often bloody engagements ensued. Gaines's Mill, Savage's Station, Glendale, and Malvern Hill. Lee's aggressive approach, characterized by a willingness to take risks and press the attack, began to reshape the perception of him as a commander. While the coordination between his various corps sometimes faltered, particularly with Jackson's forces, the sheer weight and persistence of the Confederate assaults had a profound psychological impact on the Union command. General McClellan, despite having a larger army, grew increasingly convinced that he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. He began a strategic retreat, shifting his base of supply to the James River. This withdrawal, though skillfully executed in parts, effectively relieved the immediate threat to Richmond. By July 1st, after the costly but ultimately successful Confederate assault at Malvern Hill, the 7 Days' Battles concluded. Though the Confederate army had suffered heavy casualties and had not achieved a decisive annihilation of McClellan's forces, the campaign was a strategic victory for Lee. He had successfully pushed the Union Army away from Richmond, ending the Peninsula Campaign and securing the Confederate capital. More importantly, these battles established Robert E. Lee's reputation as a daring and formidable commander, one who was willing to gamble for high stakes and whose aggressive spirit would come to define the Army of Northern Virginia. With the immediate threat to Richmond successfully averted, Robert E. Lee turned his attention northward, where a new Union Army, commanded by Major General John Pope, was gathering. Pope's aggressive stance and his orders to live off the land posed a direct challenge to Confederate control of Northern Virginia. Lee recognized the opportunity to strike before McClellan's forces, still on the Virginia Peninsula, could reinforce Pope. Lee's plan for confronting Pope was a masterclass in strategic deception and coordinated maneuver, leveraging the strengths of his principal subordinates. He dispatched Major General Thomas Stonewall Jackson's corps on a wide, sweeping march around Pope's right flank, aiming to get behind the Union Army and cut its supply lines. This audacious movement, executed with remarkable speed and secrecy, placed Jackson's forces directly in Pope's rear, seizing the Union supply depot at Manassas Junction. Jackson's bold raid infuriated Pope, who immediately turned his army to confront the elusive Confederates. For 2 days, Jackson's corps, positioned on an old railroad grade, held off repeated Union assaults, creating a fierce defensive line. It was during these intense hours that the stage was set for the arrival of the rest of Lee's army. While Jackson's men grimly held their ground, Lee, with Lieutenant General James Longstreet's corps, marched rapidly to reinforce him. On August 29th, Longstreet's troops arrived on the field, deploying on Jackson's right flank, creating a formidable and cohesive Confederate line. Pope, still believing he had trapped Jackson, continued to launch piecemeal attacks against what he thought was an isolated Confederate force. The climax of the battle arrived on August 30th. Pope, convinced that Jackson's forces were retreating, ordered a massive assault against the Confederate left. As the Union lines advanced, Longstreet's corps, which had been concealed, launched a devastating counterattack into the exposed Union flank. This powerful blow, coordinated with Jackson's continued resistance, shattered the Union lines. The ensuing rout was complete. Pope's army was driven from the field in disarray, retreating back towards Washington, D.C. The Second Battle of Manassas, or Second Bull Run, was a resounding Confederate victory. It not only cleared Northern Virginia of Union forces, but also boosted Southern morale to an unprecedented level. Lee's brilliant coordination of Jackson's rapid maneuver and Longstreet's decisive counterpunch showcased his growing mastery of battlefield command, solidifying his reputation as a general of immense strategic and tactical skill. Following the triumph at Second Manassas, Robert E. Lee made the momentous decision to carry the war into Union territory. The Maryland Campaign, initiated in September 1862, was conceived as a strategic move to relieve Virginia, gather supplies, influence the upcoming Northern elections, and potentially gain foreign recognition for the Confederacy. The Army of Northern Virginia, though weary, crossed the Potomac River into Maryland. However, the campaign soon encountered unforeseen difficulties. A lost copy of Lee's Special Order 191, detailing his troop dispositions, fell into the hands of Union General George B. McClellan. This intelligence allowed McClellan to anticipate Lee's movements and concentrate his superior forces. The Confederates, having divided their army to capture Harper's Ferry, found themselves in a precarious position. The two armies converged near Sharpsburg, Maryland, along Antietam Creek. On September 17, 1862, the Battle of Antietam unfolded, becoming the single bloodiest day in American military history. From dawn until dusk, savage fighting erupted across Farmer Miller's cornfield, along the sunken road, and at Burnside's bridge. Wave after wave of Union assaults crashed against the Confederate lines, met with determined, often desperate resistance. The cornfield saw repeated charges and countercharges, leaving rows of fallen men. The sunken road, later known as Bloody Lane, became a trench filled with casualties as both sides fought at close quarters. Late in the day, Union forces finally managed to cross Antietam Creek at a stone bridge, threatening to envelop Lee's right flank. However, the timely arrival of A.P. Hill's division, force marching from Harper's Ferry, stabilized the Confederate line just as it seemed on the verge of collapse. By nightfall, the fighting ceased. The battlefield was a scene of unparalleled devastation, with approximately 23,000 casualties on both sides. Strategically, the battle was a stalemate. Lee's invasion of the North had been halted, but McClellan had failed to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia. The following day, Lee held his ground, but on the night of September 18th, he withdrew his battered army back across the Potomac into Virginia. Though not a decisive tactical victory for the Union, Antietam had profound consequences. It provided President Abraham Lincoln with the strategic opening he needed to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This transformative decree shifted the war's objectives, adding the abolition of slavery to the preservation of the Union, thereby fundamentally altering the conflict's moral and international dimensions. Following the withdrawal from Maryland, the Army of Northern Virginia sought to recover and reorganize. The Union command, however, was in flux. General McClellan was replaced by General Ambrose Burnside, who, under pressure from Washington, devised a plan to advance on Richmond through Fredericksburg, Virginia. In December of 1862, Burnside's Army of the Potomac began its movement towards Fredericksburg, situated on the Rappahannock River. Lee, anticipating this advance, positioned his forces on the high ground overlooking the town. This terrain, known as Mary's Heights, offered a formidable defensive advantage. Along the base of the heights, a stone wall provided excellent cover for infantry, while artillery emplacements on the crest commanded clear fields of fire over the open plain below. The initial challenge for the Union Army was crossing the Rappahannock. Delays in receiving pontoon bridges allowed Lee precious time to solidify his defences. On December 11th, the Union engineers finally began to lay their bridges under heavy Confederate fire, leading to house-to-house fighting within Fredericksburg as Union troops established bridgeheads. On December the 13th, the main Union assault commenced. Burnside ordered a series of direct frontal attacks against the well-entrenched Confederate positions on Mary's Heights. Across the open ground, Union soldiers advanced through a hail of artillery and rifle fire. The stone wall, manned by Longstreet's corps, proved an impenetrable barrier. Wave after wave of Union troops were repulsed with horrific casualties. Confederate artillery systematically shelled the advancing lines, while infantry behind the wall unleashed a continuous, devastating fire. To the south of Fredericksburg, a simultaneous Union attack against Jackson's corps met with initial success, by briefly breaking through a portion of the Confederate line. However, a swift counterattack by Confederate reserves, including elements of Hood's division, quickly restored the position, repelling the Union advance with heavy losses. As the day progressed, the futility of the Union assaults on Mary's Heights became tragically apparent. Lee, observing the carnage, famously remarked, "It is well that war is so terrible, or we should grow too fond of it." The Confederate victory was decisive, achieved primarily through a strong defensive posture and the devastating effectiveness of massed fire. Burnside's army suffered over 12,000 casualties, while Confederate losses were significantly lighter, approximately 5,300. The Battle of Fredericksburg cemented Lee's reputation as a masterful defensive commander and delivered a severe blow to Union morale. The winter following Fredericksburg brought a new Union commander to the fore, Major General Joseph Hooker. He revitalized the Army of the Potomac, improving its logistics and morale, and devised an ambitious plan to outflank Lee's positions near Fredericksburg and force a decisive engagement. In late April 1863, Hooker's army, numbering over 130,000 men, began its intricate movement, aiming to strike Lee's left flank while a smaller force engaged the Confederates remaining at Fredericksburg. Lee, with an army less than half the size of Hooker's, faced a grave predicament. Outnumbered significantly, a direct engagement against Hooker's main force, which had concentrated near the crossroads of Chancellorsville in a dense, tangled wilderness, seemed perilous. Yet, Lee was not one to be easily deterred by numerical disadvantage. He made a decision that would become one of the most celebrated and audacious gambits of the war. He chose to divide his already smaller army. A force under Major General Jubal Early was left to hold the heights at Fredericksburg against the Union flanking movement, while Lee himself, with the bulk of his forces, advanced to confront Hooker. Even more astonishingly, upon reaching Chancellorsville, Lee again divided his army. On the night of May 1st, after careful reconnaissance, he approved General Stonewall Jackson's bold proposal for a wide, sweeping flank march around Hooker's right. On May 2nd, Jackson's corps, some 28,000 men, executed a lengthy, concealed march of over 12 miles through the dense woods. By late afternoon, they burst forth from the wilderness, striking the unsuspecting right flank of the Union 11th Corps, which was largely composed of German immigrants and positioned without adequate defensive preparations. The surprise was complete and devastating. The Union flank collapsed, sending thousands of soldiers fleeing in panic. Lee, meanwhile, engaged Hooker's forces directly in the centre, preventing him from reinforcing his shattered right. The Confederate victory appeared absolute. However, as dusk settled on the battlefield, tragedy struck. While reconnoitring ahead of his lines, Jackson and his staff were mistaken for Union cavalry by Confederate pickets and fired upon. Jackson was severely wounded, a loss that would cast a long shadow over the Confederate cause. Despite this grievous blow, the Battle of Chancellorsville was a tactical masterpiece for Lee. He had outmaneuvered and decisively defeated a much larger opponent through audacious strategy, precise execution, and an intimate understanding of the terrain. Though costly, the victory emboldened Lee and set the stage for his second invasion of the North. The immediate aftermath of Chancellorsville, despite the resounding Confederate victory, was shadowed by a profound and sombre realization. The severe wounding of Lieutenant General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, his accidental shooting by his own men in the fading light of May 2nd, was a blow that reverberated deeply through the Army of Northern Virginia and most acutely within its commander, Robert E. Lee. Jackson had been a singular figure, a commander whose tactical genius and unwavering resolve were almost unparalleled. His ability to execute complex, rapid maneuvers, often with little rest, earned him his famous moniker and made him Lee's most reliable and devastating instrument on the battlefield. Lee had come to depend upon Jackson's swift judgment and his capacity to turn audacious plans into decisive actions. The flanking march at Chancellorsville, a testament to Jackson's daring and execution, was to be his final brilliant stroke. Initially, there was hope for Jackson's recovery. However, complications arose. His left arm, shattered by the musket balls, required amputation. Pneumonia then set in, a common and often fatal ailment in the medical conditions of the era. On May 10th, 1863, just 8 days after he had led his corps to victory, Stonewall Jackson succumbed to his injuries. The news was received with widespread grief across the Confederacy. For Robert E. Lee, the loss was both personal and professional. He reportedly remarked, "Any victory under such circumstances is a mournful one." Lee had not only lost a friend and a trusted subordinate, but also, arguably, the most effective corps commander in his army. Jackson's aggressive spirit, his intuitive grasp of battlefield dynamics, and his relentless pursuit of the enemy were qualities that no other officer could fully replicate. The void left by Jackson's passing would prove immense. Lee's subsequent campaigns, particularly the Gettysburg campaign that would follow, would often be scrutinized in light of Jackson's absence. The harmonious and almost telepathic understanding between Lee and Jackson, which had driven so many Confederate successes, was now irrevocably broken. The cost of victory at Chancellorsville, therefore, was immeasurable, paid in the life of a general whose presence had been a cornerstone of Lee's strategic brilliance. Following the costly victory at Chancellorsville and the irreplaceable loss of Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee determined to carry the war once more into Union territory. The strategic objectives of this second invasion of the North were multifaceted. A successful campaign in Pennsylvania might relieve the pressure on Virginia, disrupt Union war efforts, garner European recognition for the Confederacy, and perhaps even compel the Union to negotiate for peace. Moreover, the Confederate supply lines in Virginia were becoming increasingly strained, and a move north offered the prospect of provisioning the army from enemy lands. In early June of 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia began its movement northwestward, aiming for Harrisburg, the capital of Pennsylvania, or perhaps even Philadelphia. The Union Army of the Potomac, now under the command of Major General George G. Meade, shadowed Lee's advance, moving northward to interpose itself between the Confederates and Washington, D.C. The two great armies, nearly 170,000 men in total, were on a collision course. The fateful encounter began on July 1st, 1863, near the quiet crossroads town of Gettysburg. Confederate forces, seeking supplies and unaware of the full extent of Union deployment, clashed with Union cavalry. What began as a skirmish quickly escalated into a full-scale engagement. On this first day, Confederate forces, initially successful, pushed Union troops through Gettysburg and onto defensive positions along Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. The second day, July 2nd, witnessed fierce and bloody fighting along the flanks of the Union line. Lee ordered attacks against the Union left, including critical positions like Little Round Top, Devil's Den, and the wheat field. Simultaneously, assaults were launched against the Union right on Culp's Hill and East Cemetery Hill. Despite desperate Confederate efforts and heavy casualties on both sides, the Union lines held. The terrain, particularly the elevated positions of the Union Army, proved formidable. The third day, July 3rd, marked the climax of the battle. Lee, convinced that the Union center was vulnerable after the previous day's attacks, ordered a massive frontal assault across open fields towards Cemetery Ridge. This became known as Pickett's Charge. Approximately 12,500 Confederate soldiers advanced under heavy artillery fire and relentless Union musketry. The charge, a desperate gamble, reached the Union line in only a few places before being repulsed with catastrophic losses. The failure of Pickett's charge signaled the end of the Gettysburg campaign. Lee's army, severely battered and diminished, began its long, sombre retreat back to Virginia on July 4th. Gettysburg represented the high watermark of the Confederacy, the point beyond which its fortunes would steadily recede. The strategic initiative had passed decisively to the Union, and the prospect of a Confederate military victory capable of securing independence grew increasingly distant. The morning of July 3rd, 1863, dawned with a heavy weight of expectation upon the battlefield of Gettysburg. Despite the fierce fighting of the previous 2 days and the significant casualties suffered, General Lee remained convinced that a decisive blow could still be struck against the Union Army. He believed that the Federal center, having been weakened by the sustained assaults on its flanks, presented a vulnerable point. This conviction led him to order one of the most audacious and ultimately tragic tactical decisions of the war: a massive frontal assault across open ground against the heart of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. The plan called for a grand charge, and primarily spearheaded by Major General George Pickett's division, along with elements from other Confederate corps. These troops, numbering approximately 12,500 men, were to march nearly a mile across gently sloping fields, exposed to enemy fire, and break through the Union defences. Before the infantry advance, a massive artillery bombardment was intended to soften the Union positions, disrupting their artillery and demoralising the defenders. At approximately 1 p.m., the Confederate artillery opened fire, unleashing a thunderous barrage that lasted for nearly 2 hours. The roar of hundreds of cannons echoed across the valley, designed to clear the way for the infantry. However, the Union artillery, positioned on the higher ground of Cemetery Ridge, responded in kind, and much of the Confederate fire overshot its targets, doing less damage than intended to the well-entrenched Union infantry. As the smoke began to clear, the long lines of Confederate soldiers emerged from the tree line on Cemetery Ridge. With flags unfurled and bayonets gleaming, they began their advance. The sight was both magnificent and terrible, a testament to the courage and discipline of the men, yet fraught with immense peril. As they crossed the Emmitsburg Road and approached the Union lines, they became fully exposed to the concentrated fire of Union artillery and musketry. Canister shot tore through their ranks, and volleys of rifle fire decimated the advancing columns. The ground became littered with fallen men. Despite the horrific casualties, pockets of Confederates driven by an unyielding determination managed to reach the angle and the stone wall, and engaging in desperate hand-to-hand combat. For a brief, agonizing moment it seemed they might break through. However, the Union defenders, reinforced and holding firm, ultimately overwhelmed the assault. The charge faltered, then broke. The remaining Confederate soldiers, those who could, turned and fled back across the open fields, pursued by Union fire. Pickett's charge was a monumental failure, a courageous but ultimately disastrous gamble that cost the Army of Northern Virginia thousands of men. It marked the definitive end of Lee's offensive at Gettysburg, and indeed the end of the Confederacy's ability to wage an offensive war on Union soil. The hope of a decisive victory in the North had vanished, leaving behind only the profound sorrow of irreparable loss. With the failure of Pickett's charge and the immense losses sustained, the third day at Gettysburg drew to a close with the Army of Northern Virginia in a precarious position. General Lee understood that further offensive action was impossible. The decision was made to withdraw from the battlefield. Under the cover of darkness and a heavy downpour that began on the night of July 4th, the long, arduous retreat back to Virginia commenced. The journey was fraught with difficulty. The Confederate wagon train, laden with thousands of wounded men, stretched for miles a slow and vulnerable target. Union cavalry harassed the retreating columns, and the swollen Potomac River presented a formidable obstacle to crossing back into Confederate territory. Lee, ever present, personally oversaw the difficult withdrawal, displaying a calm resolve even amidst the sombre atmosphere that pervaded his army. The morale of the troops, though shaken, remained remarkably intact, a testament to their enduring loyalty to their commander. The strategic implications of the defeat at Gettysburg were profound and far-reaching for the Confederacy. It marked the high water mark of the Confederate invasion of the North. Never again would the Army of Northern Virginia possess the strength or opportunity to launch such a large-scale offensive into Union territory. The hope of forcing a favourable peace settlement through a decisive victory on Northern soil had evaporated. Simultaneously, with the Union victory at Vicksburg on July 4th, the Confederacy suffered a dual blow that summer. The fall of Vicksburg gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. These two major defeats, occurring almost concurrently, profoundly shifted the momentum of the war. For Robert E. Lee, Gettysburg represented a turning point. While his army remained a potent fighting force, the strategic initiative had irrevocably passed to the Union. From this point forward, the Confederacy would largely be fighting a defensive war, seeking to preserve its remaining territory and repel the relentless advances of the Federal armies. The war, which had once seemed to hold the promise of Confederate independence, now settled into a grim struggle for survival, with the odds increasingly against the Southern cause. The mood within the Confederacy, though not immediately despairing, began to reflect a more sombre understanding of the immense task that lay ahead. Following the pivotal events of 1863, a new chapter in the American Civil War began to unfold, characterized by an escalation in the intensity and a profound shift in Union strategy. This transformation was largely due to the emergence of a new figure on the Eastern Front, Ulysses S. Grant. Having achieved significant victories in the Western Theater, notably at Vicksburg and Chattanooga, Grant's reputation as a tenacious and effective commander had grown considerably. In March 1864, President Abraham Lincoln appointed him General-in-Chief of all Union armies, recognizing in Grant a leader who possessed not only tactical skill, but also an unwavering determination to pursue the Confederate forces relentlessly. Grant chose to make his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac, directly confronting Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. This decision signalled a clear intent to personally oversee the campaign against the Confederacy's most formidable army. The stage was set for a direct and brutal confrontation between the two most prominent generals of the war. Spring of 1864 brought with it the beginning of what would become known as the Overland Campaign. This was not to be a campaign of grand manoeuvres or decisive single-day battles that sought to outwit an opponent. Instead, Grant's strategy was one of relentless pressure, a continuous advance towards Richmond, the Confederate capital, regardless of the cost. He understood that the Union possessed a numerical and industrial advantage that the Confederacy could not match. His approach was to exploit this disparity, to engage Lee's army repeatedly, to grind down its strength through a sustained war of attrition. This marked a distinct shift in the nature of the conflict in the East. Previous Union commanders had often retreated after suffering heavy casualties, allowing Lee to regroup and often regain the initiative. Grant, however, adopted a different philosophy. He aimed to keep constant pressure on Lee to prevent him from resting, reorganizing, or maneuvering defensively for long periods. Each engagement, though costly, would serve to diminish the Confederate Army's already dwindling resources and manpower. The Overland Campaign would thus be characterized by a series of bloody close-quarters battles fought in the dense wilderness and along entrenched lines. It was a brutal phase of the war, demanding immense sacrifice from both sides. But it was a strategy designed to ultimately break the Confederacy's will and capacity to continue fighting. For Robert E. Lee and his veteran army, it represented the ultimate test of endurance against an opponent who, for the first time, seemed unwilling to yield ground. The Overland Campaign began almost immediately with a brutal collision in a vast tangled expanse of second-growth forest and underbrush, known simply as the Wilderness. On May 5, 1864, Grant's Army of the Potomac, moving southward, encountered Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, which had swiftly positioned itself to block the Union advance. The terrain itself became a formidable and treacherous element of the battle. The Wilderness was a place of dense thickets, narrow trails, and limited visibility, a natural labyrinth that rendered traditional military formations and cavalry charges nearly impossible. Fighting commenced with an immediacy and ferocity that characterized the entire campaign. The thick woods absorbed the sounds of battle, creating a disorienting cacophony of musketry and cannon fire that echoed through the trees. Regiments often lost sight of one another, and commanders struggled to maintain control or even a clear understanding of the evolving battle lines. Smoke from the incessant firing combined with the dry undergrowth led to numerous brush fires, trapping wounded soldiers and adding a horrific dimension to the suffering. For 2 days, May 5th and 6th, the battle raged with an almost primal intensity. It was a fight characterized by close-quarters engagements, often hand-to-hand, where individual bravery and sheer endurance became paramount. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. Union assaults were met with fierce Confederate resistance, and Confederate counterattacks were repulsed with equal determination. The dense foliage made artillery largely ineffective, reducing the conflict to a grim infantry struggle. Casualties mounted rapidly and horrifyingly on both sides. The Union suffered approximately 17,500 killed, wounded, or missing, while the Confederates sustained around 11,000 losses. These numbers represented a staggering proportion of the forces engaged, yet after 2 days of relentless and desperate fighting, no clear victor emerged. The Wilderness was a brutal stalemate, a testament to the ferocity of the combatants and the unforgiving nature of the terrain. The battle concluded not with a decisive breakthrough, but with the two armies remaining largely in their initial positions, exhausted and battered, but still facing each other across the charred and smoke-filled landscape. Despite the horrific casualties sustained in the Wilderness, General Grant did not retreat. Instead, he made a calculated movement to the southeast, aiming to place his army between Lee and Richmond, thereby forcing Lee to maneuver and fight on ground of Grant's choosing. This strategic pivot led the two armies to Spotsylvania Courthouse, where another series of desperate engagements unfolded over nearly 2 weeks, from May 8th to May 21st, 1864. Lee, anticipating Grant's intentions, had ordered his forces to entrench themselves along a series of formidable earthworks around Spotsylvania. The Confederate lines were particularly strong at a salient, a U-shaped protrusion in the defences that became known as the Mule Shoe. It was here that some of the most intense and brutal fighting of the entire war would occur. On May 12th, Grant launched a massive pre-dawn assault on the Mule Shoe. Union troops, led by Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, initially broke through the Confederate lines, overwhelming the defenders. However, Confederate reinforcements, personally led by Lee himself at times, rushed to plug the breach. What followed was a continuous close-quarters struggle that lasted for nearly 20 hours, a relentless hand-to-hand combat amidst driving rain and thick mud. This section of the battlefield earned the grim moniker the Bloody Angle. The fighting at the Bloody Angle was characterized by its ferocity and sustained nature. Soldiers fired muskets until they were too hot to hold, then resorted to bayonets and clubbed rifles. The dead and wounded piled up in layers within the trenches, and the trees in the vicinity were literally shot to pieces by the incessant volley fire. Neither side could fully dislodge the other, and the ground was contested with an unyielding determination. While the Bloody Angle represented the peak of the fighting, skirmishes and smaller engagements continued across the Spotsylvania front for days afterward. Grant consistently probed Lee's lines, seeking a weakness, and though he never achieved a decisive breakthrough, he never ceased his relentless pressure. The battle concluded with Lee still holding his defensive positions, but Grant, true to his strategy, once again disengaged and continued his southward movement, ever closer to Richmond, leaving behind a battlefield soaked in blood and marked by immense losses on both sides. As Grant continued his methodical sidling movements, attempting to outflank Lee, the two armies again collided, this time near a crossroads known as Cold Harbor, not far from the site of the 1862 Battle of Gaines' Mill. The date was early June 1864. Lee, with his characteristic skill in defensive warfare, had once more anticipated Grant's direction, and his Confederate forces had diligently constructed a formidable network of earthworks and trenches. These defences, often concealed by dense undergrowth, stretched for miles, presenting a nearly impenetrable barrier. Grant, frustrated by the continuous stalemate and the slow, grinding nature of the overland campaign, made a fateful decision. He ordered a massive frontal assault against the entrenched Confederate positions. This was to be a direct, concentrated attack, intended to break Lee's lines once and for all. The Union High Command held their doubts, knowing the strength of the Confederate defences and the heavy cost of previous frontal assaults in the war. Yet, the orders were given. At approximately 4:30 a.m. on June 3rd, 1864, the Union attack commenced. Thousands of Federal soldiers surged forward across open ground, directly into the face of a prepared, well-sighted enemy. The Confederate defenders, protected by their earthworks, unleashed a devastating firestorm of musketry and artillery. The Union advance quickly dissolved into chaos and carnage. Rows of attacking soldiers were simply mown down, their bodies falling in sickening succession. The assault lasted for only a matter of minutes in many places, perhaps less than an hour across the entire front, before it became clear that the attack was a catastrophic failure. Union units were shattered, their formations broken, and the ground before the Confederate lines was strewn with an unimaginable number of dead and wounded. It was a scene of unmitigated disaster, a stark and brutal illustration of the futility of frontal assaults against entrenched positions in this era of warfare. Grant later expressed deep regret for ordering the attack at Cold Harbor, recognizing the tragic and unnecessary loss of life. Estimates vary, but the Union suffered approximately 7,000 casualties in that short span of time, while Confederate losses were comparatively light, perhaps 1,500. The Battle of Cold Harbor stands as one of the most lopsided and tragic engagements of the entire Civil War, a stark testament to the defensive power of the rifle and earthworks, and a moment that deeply affected the morale of the Union Army. Following the devastating repulse at Cold Harbor, Grant recognized that a direct assault on Lee's army, in its strong defensive positions, was no longer a viable strategy. Instead, he made another bold maneuver, one that would redefine the nature of the war in the East. Grant swiftly disengaged from Cold Harbor and with remarkable logistical skill moved his entire army south of the James River, aiming for the strategically vital city of Petersburg. This city, just south of Richmond, was a crucial railroad hub, connecting the Confederate capital to the rest of the South. If Petersburg fell, Richmond would be isolated and untenable. The move initiated what would become the longest siege in American history. Beginning in mid-June 1864, the campaign around Petersburg quickly devolved into a grueling war of attrition, characterized by extensive trench lines, earthworks, and fortifications that stretched for miles. Both armies dug in, creating elaborate systems of trenches, rifle pits, and artillery emplacements, reminiscent of later European conflicts. The open, maneuver-based warfare that had defined much of the conflict thus far gave way to a static, grinding stalemate. Life for the soldiers in these trenches was arduous. Days were spent under constant threat from sharpshooters and artillery fire. Nights brought the sounds of pickaxes and shovels as both sides continuously improved their defences, sometimes only yards apart. The disease was rampant, sanitation poor, and the psychological strain of continuous danger and monotony weighed heavily on the men. For Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, the siege of Petersburg represented a profound shift. No longer could they rely on swift, decisive maneuvers or brilliant tactical victories to turn the tide. Instead, they were forced into a defensive posture, stretched thin across an ever-lengthening front. The Confederate forces, already diminished by the heavy fighting of the Overland Campaign, faced a relentless opponent with superior numbers and resources. Each Union extension of their lines around Petersburg further stretched Lee's already dwindling manpower. The siege became a slow, inexorable process of wearing down the Confederacy. Grant's strategy was not simply to capture Petersburg, but to exhaust Lee's army, and to deplete its strength and resources until it could no longer effectively resist. The lines around Petersburg grew into a vast, complex labyrinth of fortifications, a silent testament to the grim determination of both sides and a harbinger of the final, desperate months of the war. As the siege of Petersburg deepened into the autumn and winter of 1864, the Confederacy's situation grew increasingly dire. The static nature of trench warfare, while initially offering defensive advantages, also exposed the South's fundamental weaknesses in manpower and industrial capacity. The trickle of supplies that had sustained Lee's army now dwindled to a thread. Food became scarce, with rations cut repeatedly. Soldiers often subsisted on meagre provisions, leading to widespread malnutrition and a corresponding increase in illness. These uniforms wore thin and were not replaced, leaving men exposed to the harsh elements of the Virginia winter. Ammunition, too, became a precious commodity, its expenditure carefully monitored. The morale of the Confederate troops, once buoyed by a string of remarkable victories, began to erode under the relentless pressure and privation. The endless digging, the constant threat of enemy fire, and the gnawing hunger took their toll. Letters from home brought news of suffering families and devastated farms, further compounding the despair. Desertion rates, which had always been a concern, began to climb steadily. Men, seeing no end to the suffering and feeling a greater duty to their starving families, slipped away from the lines under the cover of darkness, risking execution if caught. And this erosion of strength was not confined to the front lines. Across the Confederacy, the once ardent spirit of resistance began to falter. The blockade tightened, choking off vital imports. Sherman's relentless march through Georgia and then the Carolinas, leaving a path of destruction, shattered the Southern economy and its will to fight. News of these events, though often filtered, reached the soldiers in the trenches, extinguishing any lingering hopes of a strategic reversal. Lee himself was acutely aware of the deteriorating conditions. His reports to President Davis became increasingly stark, detailing the desperate need for food, clothing, and fresh recruits. He understood that his army, once a formidable offensive force, was slowly being starved and bled into submission. The Confederacy's hopes, once so vibrant, were now fading, ere replaced by a grim recognition of the inevitable. The long, weary months at Petersburg marked not only a physical decline, but also a profound psychological turning point for the Southern cause. In the face of these immense challenges at Petersburg, Robert E. Lee's leadership was characterized by a quiet, unwavering resolve. Despite the mounting evidence of his army's decline, he maintained a steadfast demeanor, projecting a sense of calm and control that helped to anchor his beleaguered troops. He moved among the trenches, speaking with soldiers, offering words of encouragement, and personally observing the conditions. This visible presence, even amidst the constant threat of enemy fire, provided a measure of comfort and inspiration to men who were enduring unimaginable hardships. Lee meticulously managed the Confederacy's ever-dwindling resources. He corresponded frequently with President Davis and other officials, urging them to prioritize the needs of his army. He made difficult decisions regarding the deployment of his limited forces, stretching his lines to the breaking point to cover the vast defensive perimeter around Petersburg and Richmond. Every brigade, every cannon, every ounce of food was allocated with the utmost care, reflecting a profound understanding of the critical nature of each asset. His strategic acumen remained sharp, even as the operational landscape grew increasingly bleak. He anticipated Union movements, fortified weak points, and continued to seek opportunities for local counter-offensives, however small, to keep Grant's forces off balance and prevent a decisive breakthrough. The defense of Richmond, the Confederate capital, became a paramount concern. Lee understood that the fall of Petersburg would inevitably lead to the loss of the capital, a blow that would be both strategically and psychologically devastating. He orchestrated a tenacious defense, employing the skills of his engineers to construct formidable earthworks and redoubts, transforming the landscape into a labyrinth of defensive positions. This allowed his numerically inferior army to hold its ground for an extended period against Grant's overwhelming numbers. His ability to maintain a coherent and disciplined fighting force under such extreme duress, with desertions rising and supplies diminishing, stands as a testament to his enduring influence and the deep loyalty he commanded from his men. He led not with grand pronouncements, but with a quiet dignity and an unyielding commitment to his duty. As March of 1865 drew to a close, the long, grueling siege of Petersburg reached its breaking point. Robert E. Lee recognized that his army, starved and outnumbered, could no longer hold its extensive lines. His last, desperate hope was to disengage from the Union forces, evacuate Petersburg and Richmond, and move westward. The intention was to march his depleted army to a point where it could potentially link up with General Joseph E. Johnston's forces in North Carolina, thereby creating a combined Confederate army that might still offer some resistance. On the night of April 2nd, under the cover of darkness, Lee initiated the withdrawal. It was a perilous manoeuvre, requiring immense discipline and secrecy from his exhausted troops. The plan involved a westward march along the Appomattox River, aiming for the Danville Railroad line, which could provide much-needed supplies and a route south. However, the Union Army under Grant was relentless in its pursuit. Federal cavalry, swift and unburdened by heavy supply trains, pressed hard on the Confederate flanks and rear. The retreat quickly devolved into a series of desperate skirmishes and forced marches. Lee's men, many without shoes, subsisted on meagre rations, often foraging for whatever they could find. The roads were muddy, the wagons bogged down, and the constant threat of Union interception hung heavy in the air. At every turn, Union forces seemed to anticipate Lee's movements, blocking his escape routes and forcing his army into increasingly tighter predicaments, or battles erupted at places like Amelia Courthouse, where vital supplies failed to arrive, and at Sailor's Creek, where a significant portion of Lee's army, including many veterans, was captured. These engagements further eroded the strength and morale of the Confederates. Lee's once formidable army of Northern Virginia was rapidly disintegrating, its ranks thinned by combat, capture, and desertion. Each setback brought the inevitable conclusion closer, yet Lee continued to drive his men onward, clinging to the fading hope of reaching a sanctuary where the struggle might continue. His face, etched with fatigue and sorrow, still conveyed a quiet determination as he rode among his suffering soldiers, a silent witness to the final agonizing days of his command. As the remnants of the Army of Northern Virginia pressed westward, their situation became increasingly dire. By April 7, 1865, after the devastating engagement at Sailor's Creek, where thousands of his men were captured, Lee's remaining forces were nearly surrounded. The Union cavalry under Sheridan had outflanked him, effectively cutting off any further escape routes to the south or west. Grant's infantry, though weary, was closing in from behind. The exhaustion and starvation among the Confederate troops were profound. Many had not eaten in days, their bodies weakened, their spirits faltering. The once proud army was now a skeletal force, capable of little more than a final, futile stand. Lee, observing the suffering of his men, understood that to continue fighting would only lead to their slaughter, a needless expenditure of lives for a cause that was, by all military calculations, lost. On April 7th, General Grant sent a direct message to Lee, suggesting that further resistance was hopeless and urging him to surrender to prevent additional bloodshed. Lee, ever mindful of his duty and the honour of his troops, initially demurred, questioning the terms and seeking clarification. He understood the immense weight of such a decision, not merely for himself, but for the entire Confederate cause and the future of the Southern people. However, the reality on the ground was undeniable. His generals, notably Longstreet and Gordon, conveyed the desperate state of their commands, confirming that the army was no longer capable of offensive action and barely able to defend itself. The reports from the front lines painted a grim picture. Men were collapsing from hunger, horses were dying, and the path ahead was blocked by overwhelming Union numbers. By April 9th, the situation had become completely untenable. Federal forces had positioned themselves directly across Lee's line of march at Appomattox Courthouse, blocking the last avenue of escape. General Gordon, leading the advance, sent word back that he had fought his command to a frazzle and could do nothing more unless heavily reinforced. Lee knew that no such reinforcements existed. It was at this moment, with his army cornered and his men facing certain destruction, that Robert E. Lee made the somber decision to surrender. It was a choice born not of defeatism, but of a deep concern for the lives of his soldiers and a desire to spare further meaningless suffering. On the morning of April 9th, 1865, a quiet and momentous meeting took place in the parlour of Wilmer McLean's house at Appomattox Courthouse. General Robert E. Lee, dressed impeccably in a fresh grey uniform with a ceremonial sword at his hip, arrived first, accompanied by his aide, Colonel Charles Marshall. He waited, a figure of solemn dignity, for the arrival of his Union counterpart. Soon after, General Ulysses S. Grant entered, dressed in a mud-splattered private's uniform, wearing only his shoulder straps to indicate his rank. His appearance was in stark contrast to Lee's formal attire, reflecting the arduous campaign he had just concluded. Despite the immense stakes and the bitter conflict that had preceded this moment, a sense of respectful gravity filled the room. The two generals, who had once served together in the Mexican-American War, exchanged polite greetings, briefly reminiscing about their shared past before addressing the immediate weighty matter at hand. Grant, with a quiet humility, began to write out the terms of surrender. The conditions he offered were remarkably generous, designed to facilitate reconciliation rather than prolong resentment. Confederate officers and men were to be paroled, meaning they could return to their homes without being held as prisoners of war. They were required to pledge not to take up arms against the United States again. Crucially, the Union allowed the Confederate soldiers to keep their horses and mules, recognizing that these animals would be essential for spring planting and the rebuilding of their devastated farms. Lee, after reviewing the terms, expressed his deep appreciation for Grant's magnanimity, then particularly regarding the horses. He understood that these terms would significantly ease the transition for his weary, defeated soldiers. The formal documents were signed, marking the official end of the Army of Northern Virginia's resistance. In this quiet room, amidst the ashes of a long and terrible war, a moment of profound peace and mutual respect unfolded, laying a foundation, however fragile, for the nation's eventual healing. Following the surrender at Appomattox, a profound quiet settled over the remaining Confederate soldiers. General Lee, ever mindful of his men, prepared a final communication, a farewell address that would resonate deeply with those who had followed him through years of hardship. On April 10th, 1865, this General Order No. 9 was issued, a poignant message delivered to a weary, disheartened army. In his address, Lee spoke with a quiet dignity, acknowledging the immense sacrifices his soldiers had made. He expressed his unalterable confidence in their valour and devotion, recognizing the strength of character they had displayed even in the face of insurmountable odds. His words were not of defeat, but of profound gratitude, a testament to the unwavering loyalty and courage he'd witnessed throughout the arduous campaigns. He affirmed that they had done all that human valour could accomplish, absolving them of any sense of personal failure in the face of overwhelming power. The address conveyed his deepest gratitude for their heroic fortitude and unsurpassed fortitude. He lamented the necessity of the surrender, attributing it to the overwhelming resources and numbers of the Union forces. There was no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance of the inevitable. Beyond gratitude, Lee's message contained a crucial directive for the future. He urged his soldiers to return to their homes and dedicate themselves to rebuilding their lives and their communities. He encouraged them to cultivate the virtues of good citizenship, emphasizing the importance of resuming their roles as productive members of society. This counsel was not merely practical, it was a profound call for a peaceful transition from soldier to civilian, from conflict to reconstruction. He bade them an affectionate farewell, a final, heartfelt parting from the men with whom he had shared so much. The words, though simple, carried the weight of history and the quiet authority of a leader guiding his followers toward an uncertain yet hopeful future. With the surrender concluded and his final orders given, Robert E. Lee embarked on the quiet journey back to Richmond. The contrast with his triumphant returns during the war years was stark. No cheering crowds now greeted the returning commander. Instead, a subdued silence enveloped the landscape, reflecting the profound exhaustion and uncertainty that gripped the South. He arrived at his rented house in Richmond, a city still scarred by the recent conflagration, its streets lined with the debris of conflict and the silent testimony of defeat. The transition from military commander to private citizen was immediate, yet fraught with complex challenges. Lee, a man whose life had been defined by service and a deep sense of duty, now found himself navigating a world irrevocably altered. And the war had not only shattered the Confederacy, but had also dismantled the very social and economic structures upon which his personal life had been built. One of the most significant losses was his ancestral home, Arlington. Situated on a commanding bluff overlooking Washington, D.C., Arlington House and its surrounding lands had been seized by the Union early in the war. Federal authorities had deemed the property abandoned due to the unpaid taxes, a consequence of Lee's decision to join the Confederacy. The land was subsequently appropriated for a national cemetery, a solemn resting place for Union soldiers. This act of confiscation was a profound personal blow, severing Lee's deep connection to his family's heritage and a place he had cherished throughout his life. Though he would later pursue legal avenues to reclaim it, the immediate post-war reality was one of dispossession. The broader landscape of the defeated South presented immense difficulties. The economy was in ruins, its infrastructure devastated, and its social order upended by emancipation. Lee, like countless others, faced an uncertain future in a region grappling with widespread poverty, psychological trauma, and the daunting task of reconstruction. The immediate aftermath was a period of profound adjustment, marked by personal loss and the collective burden of a vanquished cause, all against the backdrop of a nation attempting to heal its deep wounds. In the quiet aftermath of the war, as the South grappled with its new reality, many looked to Robert E. Lee for continued leadership. His reputation, though tarnished by defeat, remained immense among Southerners who saw in him a symbol of their lost cause and an embodiment of their ideals. It was perhaps inevitable then that offers of political office began to surface, invitations for Lee to assume a role in the reconstructed political landscape. These propositions came from various quarters, suggesting a desire among some to rally around a familiar, respected figure in a time of profound disorientation. However, Lee consistently, and with unwavering resolve, declined these overtures. His decision was rooted in a deeply held conviction that the path forward for the South, and indeed for the nation, lay not in the continuation of conflict through political means, but in a sincere effort towards healing and reconciliation. He understood that his participation in politics, particularly given his iconic status, could easily be perceived as an attempt to reignite old animosities or to resist the new order. Such an action, he believed, would only serve to prolong the suffering and division that had already consumed so much. Lee's focus was instead directed towards encouraging his fellow Southerners to accept the outcome of the war and to commit themselves to rebuilding. He advocated for a quiet, productive return to civilian life, urging former soldiers and citizens alike to embrace their duties as loyal Americans. His counsel was always towards peace, industry, and the mending of societal bonds. He recognized that the wounds of war were deep, and that true restoration would require not only physical reconstruction, but also a spiritual and psychological renewal. By stepping away from the political arena, Lee aimed to set an example. He sought to demonstrate that the future lay in constructive engagement rather than in the perpetuation of old grievances. This deliberate refusal of political power, a power he could undoubtedly have wielded, underscored his belief that true leadership in this fractured era meant guiding his people towards peace and unity, even if it meant retreating from the public eye and the clamour of political life. His actions spoke of a desire to move beyond the war, not to prolong its spirit in a different form. In the summer of 1865, as the echoes of war gradually faded, a different kind of call reached Robert E. Lee. It was an invitation not to the battlefield or the political arena, but to the quiet halls of academia. Washington College, a small struggling institution in Lexington, Virginia, extended an offer for him to assume its presidency. The college was in dire straits, its enrollment decimated, its resources depleted by the recent conflict, and its very future uncertain. It presented a challenge vastly different from those Lee had faced on the field, yet it resonated deeply with his desire to contribute to the recovery of his homeland. Lee considered the proposition carefully. He was acutely aware of his public image and the scrutiny that would accompany any decision he made. He sought counsel from friends and colleagues, weighing the implications of such a move. Ultimately, he accepted the position in August 1865, a decision that surprised some who expected him to retreat into private life or pursue more financially lucrative ventures. His acceptance was not driven by personal ambition, but by a profound sense of duty and a belief in the transformative power of education. He viewed the rebuilding of the South as inextricably linked to the intellectual and moral development of its youth. Washington College, though humble, offered a tangible means to contribute to this vital work. Lee saw the institution as a crucible where the next generation could be prepared, not for war, but for the peaceful and productive tasks of citizenship. He envisioned a curriculum that would not only impart knowledge but also instill character, integrity, and a strong work ethic, qualities he believed were essential for societal restoration. His acceptance marked a pivotal turning point in his post-war life. It signalled a clear commitment to fostering a new future for the South, one built upon the foundations of learning and reconciliation, rather than lingering resentment. The presidency of Washington College became his new mission, a testament to his enduring belief in the power of education to heal and to uplift, providing a quiet but profound service to a region desperately in need of guidance and hope. Upon assuming the presidency of Washington College, Robert E. Lee embarked upon a quiet but profound mission of educational reform and societal healing. He recognized that the post-war South required not only moral fortitude, but also practical skills to reconstruct its shattered economy. Under his gentle guidance, the curriculum underwent significant transformation, shifting to emphasize subjects directly relevant to the region's needs. Engineering, agriculture, and business administration were introduced and strengthened, reflecting a forward-looking vision for economic recovery and self-sufficiency. Lee understood that mere academic instruction was insufficient. The college had to cultivate character. He fostered an atmosphere of discipline, integrity, and honour, believing these virtues were paramount for the rising generation. His presence itself was a powerful moral force, inspiring students and faculty alike to uphold high standards of conduct. He encouraged a spirit of hard work and self-reliance, principles he had long embodied. Beyond the academic and moral development, Lee actively promoted reconciliation. He understood that the wounds of war ran deep and that unity was essential for true progress. He welcomed students from both Confederate and Union backgrounds, via ensuring that the college remained a place where former adversaries could learn and grow together. He consistently urged his students and fellow Southerners to set aside bitterness, accept the outcome of the war, and dedicate themselves to rebuilding a unified nation. His quiet authority and unwavering commitment to this principle helped to temper lingering animosities, fostering an environment where understanding and mutual respect could gradually take root. Through his patient leadership, Washington College became a quiet beacon, demonstrating how education could serve as a powerful instrument for both practical advancement and the delicate work of national reconciliation. Robert E. Lee's post-war philosophy was characterized by profound pragmatism and a clear-eyed understanding of the path forward for the South. He consistently urged his fellow Southerners to accept the irrevocability of the war's outcome, recognizing that continued resistance or resentment would only prolong suffering and impede progress. His counsel was direct yet gentle. The time for conflict had passed, and the era of rebuilding had begun. He firmly believed that the South's energy should be directed away from political grievances and towards the practical work of reconstruction. Lee encouraged individuals to return to their homes, cultivate their lands, and pursue productive livelihoods. He saw dignity in labor and stressed the importance of individual responsibility in the collective effort to restore the region. His messages emphasized industriousness, self-reliance, and a focus on domestic duties, rather than dwelling on past glories or perceived injustices. Crucially, Lee advocated for a future free from bitterness. He understood that lingering animosity towards the Union would only poison the spirit of the South and hinder its reintegration into the nation. He urged a cessation of sectional animosity, advising a quiet dignity in defeat and a forward-looking perspective. His own conduct exemplified this philosophy. He remained steadfastly apolitical, declining opportunities that might have reignited old divisions. Instead, he channeled his influence into education, providing a tangible pathway for the younger generation to contribute to a new, unified America. His vision was not one of defiance, but of patient endurance and the gradual healing work of renewal, grounded in the belief that a reconciled South could once again prosper within the Union. The years following the war brought a noticeable decline in Robert E. Lee's already robust health. The immense physical and mental strain of commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, particularly during the grueling final campaigns, had taken a significant toll. The relentless pressure of responsibility, coupled with the profound weight of defeat, had left an indelible mark upon his constitution. He had endured much during the conflict, often neglecting his own well-being in service to his cause, and the consequences of those years began to manifest more clearly in his post-war life. Throughout the war, Lee had suffered from various ailments, including rheumatism and heart palpitations, which intensified as the conflict wore on. The stress of constant campaigning, the arduous rides, and the immense burden of decision-making under fire had steadily eroded his physical reserves. After Appomattox, the emotional burden of the South's devastation and his personal sense of responsibility for its fate added another layer of strain. Though he maintained a composed demeanor publicly, the internal struggles were evident in his physical decline. In his final years at Washington College, despite his unwavering dedication to his new mission, his health continued to falter. He suffered a stroke in 1869 which further weakened him, and his condition gradually worsened. Yet, even in the face of increasing physical frailty, Lee maintained a quiet dignity that was characteristic of his entire life. He continued his duties at the college with steadfast resolve, greeting visitors and students with the same courteous grace, yet though his movements became slower and his strength diminished. His final illness culminated in October of 1870. After presiding over a vestry meeting at his church, he became ill and was confined to his bed. He passed away peacefully a few weeks later, on October 12th, 1870, at the age of 63. His death was met with widespread mourning across the South, and indeed throughout much of the nation. In his quiet passing, Lee maintained the same composure and stoicism that had defined his public life, leaving behind a legacy marked by an enduring sense of duty, even in his final fading moments. The final chapter of Robert E. Lee's life began in the autumn of 1870, quietly and without fanfare, much like the man himself. On September 28th, he attended a vestry meeting at Grace Episcopal Church in Lexington, Virginia. The meeting was prolonged, and the air within the church was chill. Lee, already weakened by his earlier stroke and the accumulated strains of his life, felt a distinct coldness upon leaving. Upon his return to his home at Washington College, he found himself unable to speak clearly, a clear indication of a serious affliction. He was immediately put to bed, and it became evident that he had suffered another more severe stroke. The medical attention he received was diligent, but the damage was extensive. For several weeks he lingered, his mind reportedly clear at times, though his speech remained impaired. His family, particularly his wife Mary and his children, remained at his bedside, observing the slow, inexorable decline. The news of his illness spread, and a quiet vigil began to be kept, not only in Lexington but across the South. And as the days turned into weeks, his strength continued to ebb. He passed away peacefully on the morning of October the 12th, 1870, at his home on the campus of Washington College. His last recorded words, though indistinctly spoken, were said to be, "Strike the tent." The precise meaning of these final words has been subject to various interpretations, but they convey a sense of peaceful departure, an acceptance of the inevitable end. The reaction to his death was profound and widespread. In the South, a wave of deep mourning swept through communities. Flags were lowered to half-staff, and memorial services were held in countless towns and cities. Even in the North, where he had been a formidable adversary, there was a solemn acknowledgement of his passing. Many newspapers, even those that had been critical of him during the war, published respectful obituaries recognizing his military genius and his personal character. Former Union generals, including Ulysses S. Grant, expressed their condolences, acknowledging the loss of a great American. The quiet dignity with which Lee had lived his post-war years, advocating for reconciliation and education, had resonated even with those who had once stood against him in battle, fostering a degree of national reverence in his final moments. The news of Robert E. Lee's passing on October 12, 1870, resonated deeply across the American landscape, particularly within the former Confederate states. An immediate and profound outpouring of grief enveloped the South. For many Southerners, Lee had become a symbol of their lost cause, a figure embodying courage, sacrifice, and integrity in the face of overwhelming odds. His death was felt not merely as the loss of a distinguished general, but as the passing of a revered patriarch, a leader who had guided them through the crucible of war and then urged them towards peace and reconstruction. Throughout the South, memorial services were held draped in solemnity and respect. Churches were filled, and eulogies spoke of his unwavering character, his strategic brilliance, and his quiet dignity in defeat. Flags were flown at half-mast, and businesses often closed as a mark of respect. The widespread mourning demonstrated the enduring emotional attachment many felt towards him, transforming his death into a collective moment of remembrance for a bygone era and a lost way of life. In the North, reactions were more complex, though often marked by a respectful acknowledgement of his stature. While some still harboured resentment for his role in the rebellion, many prominent figures, including former Union commanders, recognized his military genius and his personal honor. Newspapers, even those previously critical, offered measured tributes, focusing on his post-war efforts towards reconciliation and his leadership at Washington College. There was an understanding that despite their differences, Lee had represented a significant, if tragic, chapter in American history. It was in these immediate days following his death that the initial contours of his mythologization began to form. The grief in the South naturally led to an idealization of his image, portraying him as an almost flawless figure, a chivalrous warrior who had fought honorably for his homeland. This nascent myth, emphasizing his virtues and often subtly overlooking the complexities of his allegiances and the cause he served, would grow and evolve in the decades that followed, shaping his place in the collective memory of the nation. His passing, therefore, was not merely an end, but also a beginning, the start of a long process of historical interpretation and cultural remembrance. In the years following the Civil War, and particularly after the death of Robert E. Lee, a distinctive historical interpretation began to coalesce in the American South. This framework, eventually known as the Lost Cause narrative, emerged as a profound mechanism for many Southerners to process the devastating experience of defeat, the abolition of slavery, and the subsequent societal upheaval. It served as a means to rationalize the Confederacy's struggle and to preserve a sense of honor and identity amidst the ruins of their former world. Central to this evolving narrative was the idealized figure of Robert E. Lee. He was positioned as the quintessential Southern gentleman, a brilliant and morally upright commander who, despite his personal opposition to secession and slavery, reluctantly chose to defend his home state out of an unshakable sense of duty. Within the Lost Cause, Lee became the embodiment of virtue, courage, and self-sacrifice. His military campaigns, even those ending in defeat, were often reinterpreted as valiant struggles against overwhelming odds, fought with superior moral character if not material resources. Yet the Lost Cause narrative meticulously downplayed the role of slavery as the primary cause of the war, instead emphasizing states' rights and a romanticized vision of the antebellum South. It presented Confederate soldiers, led by figures like Lee, not as rebels fighting to preserve an unjust system, but as noble patriots defending their homes and way of life against Northern aggression. This reframing allowed Southerners to mourn their losses without fully confronting the moral implications of their cause. Lee's character, as portrayed in this narrative, became almost sacrosanct. He was depicted as a man of profound piety, humility, and unwavering principle, whose post-war actions of encouraging reconciliation further cemented his image as a national, rather than merely sectional hero. By elevating Lee to such an exalted status, The Lost Cause provided a powerful, comforting story that helped a generation of Southerners rebuild their pride and navigate the complex realities of Reconstruction and beyond. It was a narrative designed to heal wounds, albeit by selectively remembering and reshaping the past. Beyond the specific context of the Lost Cause narrative, Robert E. Lee also came to symbolize a set of enduring virtues for many across different eras and regions. His image was carefully cultivated and perceived as embodying duty, honor, and sacrifice, qualities that often transcended the particular political or social cause he served. This perception was rooted in aspects of his personal conduct and public demeanor throughout his life, both before, during, and after the Civil War. Lee's decision to resign from the United States Army and lead Virginia's forces, despite his personal reservations about secession, was frequently interpreted as a profound act of duty to his home state and family. This choice, agonizing as it was, became a cornerstone of his symbolic power. It suggested a man who placed loyalty in the defense of his native land above personal ambition, or even national unity, a difficult but honorable commitment. This narrative allowed many to admire his character, even if they disagreed with his cause, seeing in him a man who simply did what he believed was right, regardless of the cost. His conduct during the war further solidified this image. Lee was consistently portrayed as a commander who shared the hardships of his men, who maintained a calm and dignified bearing under immense pressure, and who bore the weight of command with solemn responsibility. Even his adversaries often spoke of his chivalry and professional integrity. This perception of unwavering honour resonated deeply, painting him as a figure who upheld a strict moral code even in the brutal realities of conflict. The post-war period provided further evidence for this symbolic elevation. Lee's actions at Appomattox, offering terms of surrender with dignity, and his subsequent efforts to encourage reconciliation and education were seen as acts of profound self-sacrifice. He declined lucrative offers and political opportunities, choosing instead a quieter life dedicated to rebuilding a college and, by extension, the character of the South. This demonstrated a dedication to principle over personal gain, reinforcing the image of a man who prioritized the welfare of others and the restoration of a fractured society. Thus, while Lee became a complex symbol, for some he represented the tragic hero, a man of immense virtue caught in an impossible situation. For others, he embodied an ideal of leadership marked by integrity, resilience, and a profound sense of obligation. These personal virtues, attributed to him and widely disseminated, allowed his image to endure as a powerful emblem of duty, honour, and sacrifice, extending beyond the specific historical context of the Confederacy itself. The historical understanding of Robert E. Lee has undergone significant transformation across the decades since his passing. Immediately following the Civil War and for many years thereafter, particularly in the South, Lee was largely venerated. This period saw the ascendance of the Lost Cause narrative, which portrayed him as a heroic, almost saintly figure, a brilliant general who fought honourably for a noble, if ultimately doomed, cause. During this era, criticisms of Lee were rare and often muted, especially within Southern discourse. His military prowess, his perceived personal integrity, and his post-war efforts towards reconciliation were frequently highlighted, forming a largely unblemished image of a national hero, albeit one whose loyalties had been divided. As the 20th century progressed, and especially with the advent of the Civil Rights Movement, the interpretations of Lee and the Confederacy began to face more rigorous scrutiny. Historians and the public alike started to re-evaluate the foundational causes of the Civil War, placing greater emphasis on the institution of slavery as its central catalyst. This shift in understanding inevitably led to a more critical examination of figures like Lee. Questions arose concerning his decision to fight for the Confederacy, a government explicitly formed to preserve and expand slavery, even as he personally expressed reservations about the institution. The later half of the 20th century and into the 21st century brought increasingly nuanced and often challenging assessments. Scholars began to delve deeper into Lee's own relationship with slavery, scrutinizing his actions as an enslaver and his views on emancipation. His role in a conflict that perpetuated human bondage became a more prominent feature of historical discussion, moving beyond the simpler narratives of duty and honour. The focus expanded to consider the moral implications of his choices and the broader societal impact of the Confederacy he led. Contemporary interpretations often grapple with the complexities of Lee's legacy. While his military genius and personal decorum are still acknowledged, these are now often viewed in conjunction with his participation in a slaveholding society and his command of an army fighting to maintain that system. Debates surrounding Confederate monuments and symbols have further amplified these evolving perspectives, prompting a national conversation about how historical figures, particularly those associated with divisive causes, should be remembered and contextualized within public memory. The trajectory of Lee's historical standing reflects a broader societal effort to confront difficult aspects of the past. He's moving from uncritical admiration toward a more comprehensive and often more challenging understanding of his multifaceted role in American history. The legacy of Robert E. Lee finds tangible expression in numerous monuments and memorials scattered across the American landscape. These physical manifestations, often cast in bronze or carved from stone, served for many decades as silent, yet powerful, affirmations of a particular historical narrative. Erected primarily during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a period coinciding with the Jim Crow era and the entrenchment of racial segregation, these statues and plaques were not merely historical markers. They often functioned as symbols of Southern identity, expressions of the lost cause ideology, and for many, as deliberate assertions of white supremacy. For generations, as these monuments stood largely unchallenged, their presence woven into the fabric of public spaces, parks, and city squares, they contributed to a collective memory that often romanticized the Confederacy and its leaders, presenting figures like Lee as valiant defenders of a noble, if ultimately lost, way of life. For some, these memorials continue to represent heritage, honor, and a connection to ancestral traditions. They view them as integral parts of the historical landscape, deserving of preservation as testaments to the past, regardless of its complexities. However, in contemporary society, the meaning and placement of these physical tributes have become subjects of intense and often impassioned debate. For a significant portion of the population, particularly African Americans and those advocating for racial justice, these monuments evoke pain, oppression, and the enduring legacy of slavery. They are seen not as innocuous symbols of history, but as celebrations of a system built on human bondage and a visual reminder of racial inequality. The presence of such statues in public spaces is increasingly viewed as an affront, glorifying figures who fought to maintain an unjust social order. This fundamental divergence in interpretation has led to widespread calls for the removal, relocation, or recontextualization of Confederate monuments, including those dedicated to Robert E. Lee. Cities and communities across the nation have grappled with how to reconcile these conflicting perspectives. The debates reflect a broader societal reckoning with historical memory, questioning whose stories are told, how they are told, and what messages are conveyed through public art and commemoration. The future of these physical manifestations of Lee's legacy remains a dynamic and evolving aspect of America's ongoing conversation with its past. Robert E. Lee occupies a complex and often contradictory position within the modern American consciousness. No longer the uniformly revered figure of earlier generations, his legacy is now scrutinized through a multifaceted lens, acknowledging both the perceived virtues of his character and the undeniable historical context of his actions. This contemporary understanding seeks to move beyond simplistic veneration or outright condemnation, striving instead for a more complete and historically grounded perspective. For many, Lee remains a compelling figure, embodying a tragic sense of duty and a commitment to his home state, even when that commitment led him to oppose the Union. They might acknowledge his personal opposition to secession and slavery in principle, while still recognizing his ultimate decision to lead the Confederate Army. This view often emphasizes his military brilliance, his conduct during the war, and his efforts toward reconciliation in its aftermath, seeing him as a man caught in an impossible historical bind. The quiet dignity often attributed to him continues to resonate with those who value stoicism and personal integrity. Conversely, a critical examination of Lee's life places his role in the Confederacy and his ownership of enslaved people at the forefront. Modern scholarship increasingly highlights the economic and moral implications of slavery, emphasizing that Lee, despite any personal reservations, was a beneficiary and enforcer of this brutal institution. His decision to fight for a cause that explicitly sought to preserve slavery is now viewed by many as an indelible stain on his legacy, overshadowing other aspects of his life. The argument is often made that to separate Lee from the cause he served is to ignore a fundamental truth of his historical impact. The ongoing effort to understand Lee within a full historical context requires grappling with these inherent complexities. It involves acknowledging that historical figures are products of their time, yet also holding them accountable to timeless moral principles. It means recognizing that individuals can embody both admirable qualities and profound moral failings. The modern consciousness seeks to integrate the various facets of Lee's life: his family background, his distinguished military career, his agonizing choice, his leadership of the Confederacy, his post-war efforts, and the subsequent construction and deconstruction of his public image. This nuanced approach does not aim to erase history, but rather to deepen our understanding of it. It is an ongoing dialogue shaped by evolving societal values and new historical insights about how the past informs the present. Lee's place in the modern consciousness is thus not fixed, but rather a dynamic space of continuous re-evaluation, reflecting America's persistent journey to comprehend its own intricate narrative. Robert E. Lee, in his entirety, ultimately stands not as a figure solely for judgment, but rather as a profound subject for quiet contemplation. His life, stretching from the early days of the American Republic through its most profound crisis, presents a mosaic of choices, obligations, and consequences. To truly understand him is to engage with the forces that shaped an individual navigating an era of immense upheaval, where deeply held loyalties clashed with emerging national identities and fundamental moral questions. One might consider the weight of his lineage, his connection to the Founding Fathers, and the expectations placed upon a Virginia gentleman of his era. How did these ancestral echoes influence his sense of duty and his perception of honor? The decision to align with his home state, rather than the Union he had served for decades, was not made lightly. It was a choice born from a crucible of conflicting allegiances, a personal drama played out against the backdrop of a nation tearing itself apart. Contemplating this moment allows for an exploration of the profound nature of loyalty itself, to family, to state, to nation, and the tragic impossibility of satisfying all such claims when they diverge. Lee also represents the enduring questions surrounding the nature of leadership during times of profound moral compromise. How does a leader reconcile personal convictions with the demands of a cause, particularly one built upon an indefensible institution? His strategic brilliance and his perceived personal virtues exist in uncomfortable proximity to his command of an army fighting to preserve slavery. This juxtaposition invites reflection on the complexities of human character, where admirable traits can coexist with participation in systems of injustice. His post-war conduct, characterized by a commitment to reconciliation and education, offers another dimension for consideration. Was this a genuine attempt at healing, or a strategic move to preserve a particular societal order? The answers are not simple, inviting a deeper look into the motivations and impacts of actions taken in the shadow of defeat. Ultimately, Lee's life encourages us to ponder the intricate tapestry of history itself. It reminds us that historical figures are not monolithic symbols, but individuals whose lives were shaped by the specific circumstances of their time, their personal beliefs, and the societal structures in which they operated. His story is a continuous invitation to reflect on the enduring questions of duty, loyalty, morality, and the complex, often challenging, process of historical understanding. The long journey through the life of Robert E. Lee ultimately reminds us that history is not a static collection of facts, but a continuous unfolding narrative, perpetually reinterpreted by each generation. It is a vast and intricate tapestry, woven with countless individual threads, each contributing to the grand design, yet each also subject to its own unique colour and texture. Lee's personal story, with all its complexities and contradictions, represents but one such thread within the immense fabric of American history. His experiences, from the quiet discipline of West Point to the thundering battlefields of the Civil War, and finally to the reflective years of reconciliation, offer a unique lens through which to view the broader currents of his era. Through his life, assessed, we gain insights not only into the specific events of the 19th century, but also into universal aspects of human nature itself. We observe the enduring power of loyalty, the burden of command, the agony of difficult choices, and the profound impact of societal structures on individual destinies. The passage of time inevitably reshapes our understanding of the past. What was once seen as unassailable truth may, with new perspectives and further scholarship, reveal deeper layers of meaning, or even entirely different interpretations. Lee's legacy, as we've explored, has undergone just such a transformation, moving from widespread veneration to a more critical and nuanced examination. This ongoing re-evaluation is not a flaw in history, but rather its inherent strength, a testament to its living, breathing quality. Every generation brings its own questions to the past, informed by its present concerns and values. The debate surrounding Lee today, his monuments, his role in the Confederacy, his relationship with slavery, are not merely about a figure from long ago, but also about how a society grapples with its own foundations, its ideals, and its unresolved tensions. These discussions reflect our ongoing effort to understand who we are by understanding where we've come from. Thus, the life of Robert E. Lee becomes a perpetual invitation to engage with the past, not as a closed book, but as an open dialogue. It encourages us to look beyond simple narratives, to embrace ambiguity, and to recognize that the pursuit of historical understanding is an endless journey of discovery, offering continuous opportunities for reflection and insight into the ever-unfolding tapestry of human experience. As we gently conclude our quiet journey through the complete life of Robert E. Lee, we are left with a profound sense of time's ceaseless flow, a river that carries all lives and all events into the quietude of history. The meticulous study of such a life, with its triumphs and its sorrows, its certainties and its dilemmas, offers a unique form of contemplation, an opportunity to observe the past with a detached and thoughtful gaze. Our intention throughout this narrative has been to maintain a calm, neutral observation, allowing the historical record to speak softly for itself. There has been no dramatic flourish, no speculative interpretation, but rather a steady, even presentation of facts and their established contexts. This approach, we hope, has fostered an atmosphere conducive to reflection and perhaps to a tranquil descent into rest. The lives of individuals like Robert E. Lee, when viewed through the lens of historical inquiry, serve as quiet reminders of the intricate forces that shape human existence. They illuminate the way personal character intersects with grand societal movements, how individual choices can reverberate through generations, and how the passage of years inevitably reconfigures our understanding of what has come before. As the ambient sounds of the night gently deepen and the echoes of history begin to recede, we are reminded that the past, though distant, continues to offer lessons and insights for those willing to listen with patience and an open mind. The grand tapestry of history, ever unfolding, remains a source of endless fascination, a quiet testament to the enduring human story. May this exploration of a significant life, presented with care and quiet authority, have brought a measure of peace and a deeper understanding. The gentle passage of time continues, carrying with it all the stories, all the legacies into the quiet embrace of memory.